What if the entire universe you ever knew was a ship? Your grandparents made the decision. You were born inside it, a generation ship moving through the deepest darkness in human history toward a star your eyes will never reach in your lifetime. But how long would we survive in there? How long before something breaks? If questions like this make your brain light up, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now let's get started. The concept of a generation ship is not new. It has lived in science fiction for most of the 20th century. Giant arcs carrying humanity across the light years, with entire civilizations rising and falling inside their hulls during the crossing. But what makes this topic so urgent and so genuinely fascinating right now is that it has crossed over from fiction into serious academic research. There are published papers, there are mathematical models, there are population genetics studies, closed-loop ecology experiments, long-duration isolation studies, and engineering concepts being developed by real institutions with real funding. The generation ship is no longer just a story. It is a problem, a specific, technical, solvable in principle, but extraordinarily difficult in practice problem. And the people working on it are asking questions that cut right to the heart of what human beings actually are when you strip away everything familiar and leave only the ship. First, let's establish the scale of the challenge, because without understanding the distance involved, nothing else about this conversation makes sense. The nearest star system to our own is Alpha Centauri, a triple system that includes Proxima Centauri, the single closest individual star, sitting 4.24 light-years away. A light-year is the distance light travels in 1 year, moving at roughly 300,000 kilometers per second. That works out to approximately 9.5 trillion kilometers per light-year. 4.24 light-years is therefore roughly 40 trillion kilometers. The fastest spacecraft humanity has ever launched, the Voyager probes, moving at around 17 kilometers per second, would take approximately 75,000 years to cover that distance. Even the most optimistic near-future propulsion concepts, like nuclear pulse drives or laser-propelled light sails, would require decades to centuries for a crewed mission carrying the mass necessary to sustain a population of human beings. This is why the generation ship concept exists, because the distances involved in interstellar travel are so vast that no individual human life, no matter how long, no matter how well preserved by hypothetical cryogenic technology, may be sufficient to bridge them alone. And so the idea emerged, what if the crew didn't need to survive the whole journey? What if the journey itself became a civilization? What if you sent not just people, but a self-sustaining society, complete with the biology, the culture, the knowledge, and the social structures needed to produce, generation after generation, people capable of completing a mission that no single one of them will live to see begin and end? It sounds, when you say it out loud, almost impossibly ambitious. And it is. But it is not impossible, and that distinction between hard and impossible is where all the most interesting science lives. Now, if you want to understand what interstellar distances actually feel like, before we dive into what life on a generation ship would look like, I made a video recently that walks through exactly that. A full, scientifically grounded journey to Proxima Centauri. It covers the propulsion, the time dilation, the radiation, the psychology, and what we might actually find when we get there. The link is in the description and pinned on the comments. Watch it after this one. It will make everything we discussed today land even harder. So let's talk about the ship itself. What kind of structure are we actually imagining here? A generation ship, to function as a genuine long-term habitat for a human population, would need to be orders of magnitude larger and more complex than anything we have ever built in space. The International Space Station, currently the largest human-made structure in orbit, has a habitable volume of roughly 935 cubic meters, a space that comfortably houses 6 people for 6-month rotations with regular resupply missions from Earth. A generation ship carrying the minimum viable population needed to maintain genetic diversity and social stability, a number we will get to shortly, because it is one of the most debated and consequential figures in this entire conversation, would require habitable volume measured not in hundreds of cubic meters, but in hundreds of thousands or millions. The ship would need to generate its own gravity, not because gravity is comfortable, though it is, but because without it, the human body deteriorates in ways that would be catastrophic over the timescales we are discussing. Extended weightlessness causes bone density loss. Astronauts on the International Space Station lose approximately 1 to 2% of bone mass per month in certain regions. Despite rigorous daily exercise regimens, muscle atrophy accelerates. The cardiovascular system adapts to a fluid shift that redistributes blood toward the upper body, stressing the heart and potentially causing vision problems linked to increased intracranial pressure, a condition researchers call spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, which has been observed in astronauts returning from long-duration missions. Over decades without gravity, these effects would compound in ways that current medicine cannot fully predict or prevent. The solution most seriously proposed is rotation. A rotating section of the ship, a ring or cylinder spinning at a carefully calculated rate, would generate centrifugal force that mimics the effect of gravity. Arthur C. Clarke wrote about it. NASA has modeled it. The physics works. But building a rotating habitat large enough to house hundreds or thousands of people, robust enough to function for centuries without catastrophic failure, and capable of being maintained by the people living inside it, using only the resources available on the ship, that is an engineering challenge that dwarfs anything in human history. The ship also needs to feed everyone for generations. This is not a problem that can be solved with stored food. You cannot pack enough calories to sustain a population of hundreds of people for a century or more. The mass alone would be prohibitive, and the degradation of stored food over those timescales would render it inedible long before arrival. The ship must grow its food. It must be, in the most literal sense, a closed-loop agricultural system, one in which the waste products of human metabolism are recycled into the nutrients that grow the plants, that feed the humans that produce the waste products. Nothing leaves the system, nothing enters from outside. Every atom of nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, and water must be cycled and recycled with an efficiency that makes current agricultural practices look catastrophically wasteful by comparison. We have prototypes of this kind of system. The Melissa project, microecological life support system alternative, has been running at a European Space Agency facility in Barcelona for decades, developing and testing closed-loop life support technologies that could theoretically sustain a crew indefinitely without resupply. It uses a series of compartments, bioreactors, algae cultivation tanks, higher plant growth chambers, and composting systems linked in a cycle that processes waste, produces food, purifies water, and generates breathable air. It works in principle. In practice, current versions are nowhere near the efficiency and reliability needed for a century-long mission, but the direction of the research is clear, and the progress is real. Beyond plants, the dietary needs of a human population over multiple generations include proteins, fats, and micronutrients that a purely plant-based system may struggle to provide in adequate quantities and variety. Some researchers have proposed insect farming, highly efficient in terms of protein yield per kilogram of feed, low in required space, and technically feasible in a closed environment. Others have proposed algae-based protein supplements, cultured meat grown from cell cultures, or carefully managed small animal populations. The nutritional ecology of a generation ship is a genuine scientific research area, and the answers are not simple. Now here is the question that keeps population geneticists up at night. And it is, in many ways, the foundational constraint on everything else about this mission. How many people do you need? The answer matters because genetic diversity is not just a nice to have. It is a survival requirement. Humans, like all sexually reproducing species, carry 2 copies of each gene, one from each parent. Many genetic diseases are recessive, meaning they only manifest when a person inherits a defective copy from both parents. In a large, diverse population, the chances of 2 carriers of the same recessive mutation meeting and producing affected offspring are relatively low, but in a small, isolated population, one cut off from the rest of the human gene pool for generations, a process called genetic drift takes over. Rare alleles can become common by random chance. Mutations that are harmless in one copy can become widespread enough that harmful 2-copy combinations start appearing with alarming frequency. Inbreeding, even at low levels over many generations, compounds these effects. The result, seen repeatedly in small isolated human populations throughout history, is a measurable decline in health, fertility, and cognitive function over time. This is the genetic bottleneck problem, and it is one of the most serious biological constraints facing any generation ship mission. So what is the minimum number? Early estimates, working from population genetics models, suggested that a founding population of around 160 individuals might be sufficient if managed very carefully with deliberate attention to pairing and reproduction. More recent and more rigorous analyses have pushed that number significantly higher. A 2014 study by anthropologist Cameron Smith at Portland State University concluded that a minimum viable population for an interstellar voyage of around 140 years would require somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 individuals to maintain robust genetic health across the journey, accounting for disease, accidents, and the statistical realities of random genetic drift. 10,000 to 40,000 people on a ship for a century or more. That is not a crew, that is a city. And a city, as we know, is not just a collection of bodies. It is a social system, a political system, a cultural system, a system of values, laws, conflicts, hierarchies, and human relationships that evolves over time in ways that are notoriously difficult to predict and even harder to control, which is where things start to get genuinely complicated and genuinely fascinating, because we haven't even talked yet about what happens to the human mind over generations of confinement, about what a society looks like when it has no outside world, about the political structures that emerge when there is no exit, no option to leave, no other country to emigrate to, no wilderness to disappear into, about what children are told about a destination that none of them will live to see, about how you keep a mission alive, not just in the hardware of a ship, but in the hearts and minds of people who were born into it and never chose it, and may not, in the deepest part of themselves, believe in it. That is where we are going next. And I promise you, the psychology of a generation ship is every bit as mind-bending as the engineering. Stay with me. Let's start with a thought experiment, not a hypothetical, a real one. One that researchers have actually run in various forms because the questions it raises are too important to leave to imagination alone. You are 12 years old. You were born on the ship. You have never seen a sky that wasn't a ceiling. You have never felt wind that wasn't recycled air moving through a ventilation system. You have never stood on ground that didn't hum faintly with the vibration of engines that have been running since before your parents were born. You know, because you were taught that somewhere ahead, decades ahead, further than you can genuinely feel in your body, there is a star, a real one, and around it a planet. And the mission of every person on this ship, including you, including the children you will one day raise, is to reach it, but you will never reach it. Not you, personally. You will live your life, grow old, and die on this ship, in this recycled air, under this artificial sky. The destination is not yours. It belongs to people who don't exist yet. How do you feel about that? More importantly, how do you behave? And what happens to a society made up of millions of people who all share that same fundamental condition? This is the psychological and sociological core of the generation ship problem, and it is, in the opinion of many researchers who study it, a harder problem than the engineering. Let's talk about what psychologists call existential grounding. Every human being, to function well over the course of a life, needs a sense of meaning that extends beyond the immediate present. We need to feel that our actions matter, not just now, but in some larger context that outlasts the moment. For most of human history, that context has been provided by a combination of things: family, community, culture, religion, legacy, the physical landscape we inhabit, the continuity of a world that was here before us and will be here after us. These anchors are so deeply embedded in our psychology that we barely notice them until they are removed. On a generation ship, most of these anchors are fundamentally altered or absent. The landscape is artificial and unchanging. The community is sealed and finite. The same people or their descendants forever. The culture must be deliberately constructed and maintained rather than naturally evolved. And the central purpose of the entire civilization, reaching the destination, is something that the vast majority of the people alive at any given moment will never personally experience. Psychologists who study isolated and confined environments, Antarctic winter overstations, submarine deployments, long-duration space missions, have documented what happens to human beings under sustained conditions of confinement and monotony. Irritability increases. Small conflicts that would be trivial in an open environment become significant because there is no escape from them. Sleep disturbances are common. Motivation fluctuates in patterns tied to the phase of the mission, the third quarter effect, where morale drops most sharply when the end is far enough away to feel unreal. Depression and anxiety rates climb. Now take those findings and extend them across not months but generations. The psychological pressures of confinement don't disappear when one generation dies and the next takes over. They are transmitted through culture, through parenting styles, through the accumulated institutional memory of a society that has been under stress for longer than anyone alive can personally remember. The children of stressed, confined people are raised by stressed, confined people. The emotional and psychological patterns that emerge in extreme isolation don't reset with each new generation. They compound. There is a specific phenomenon that researchers who think seriously about generation ships keep returning to. It doesn't have a universally agreed name, but it is sometimes called the problem of the interstellar middle generations. Think about it this way. The founding generation, the people who actually chose to board the ship, who volunteered for the mission, who felt the specific, personal, deeply held conviction that this journey was worth everything it would cost. Those people have something powerful. They have purpose. They have the memory of Earth, however faded. They have the lived experience of making the decision. Their motivation, whatever its psychological roots, is genuine and personal. The arrival generation, the people alive when the ship finally reaches its destination, who get to see the star resolve from a point of light into a disk, who watch the planet grow in the forward cameras, who will be the first to set foot on another world. Those people also have something powerful. They have the tangible proximity of the goal. The finish line is visible. The thing they were raised to complete is actually finally happening. Their sense of purpose is acute and real, even if they didn't choose it any more than you chose the country you were born in. But the people in between, The second generation, the fifth, the ninth, what do they have? They cannot remember Earth. The destination is so far away it is meaningless as a felt reality. They live their entire lives in the middle of something they didn't start and won't finish. They are, in the most literal sense, means to an end, the biological and social mechanism by which the mission perpetuates itself across time. And human beings historically do not respond well to being treated as means to an end, especially when they are smart enough to understand that is exactly what they are. This is not a small problem. It is potentially a civilization-ending one, because a society that loses faith in the mission it was built around does not simply become apathetic. It reorganizes, it finds new purposes, new hierarchies, new belief systems, and those new systems may or may not be compatible with the original mission. History is full of examples of institutions that drifted catastrophically from their founding purpose when the original generation of believers was replaced by people who inherited the form of the institution without the fire of its founding conviction. On Earth, when an institution drifts, the consequences are usually manageable. The institution fails, reforms, or is replaced by something better. On a generation ship, with nowhere to go and no outside world to appeal to, institutional drift is not just a governance problem. It is an existential threat to the mission and to the people on the ship. So what do you do about it? How do you design a society, deliberately from the beginning, that can sustain its purpose and its cohesion across multiple generations of people who never chose to be there? Researchers have proposed several approaches, and each of them is fascinating in its own right. The first is what might be called purposive culture design. The idea is that the culture of the ship, its stories, its rituals, its values, its art, its religious or quasi-religious practices must be deliberately engineered from the beginning to keep the mission central to every person's sense of identity and meaning. Not through coercion, but through the kind of deep cultural embedding that makes certain values feel like they belong to the individual rather than being imposed from outside. The way that a national identity, at its best, makes people feel genuinely proud to belong to something larger than themselves. Not because they were forced to feel that way, but because the culture they grew up in wove that feeling into the fabric of who they are. This sounds reasonable in the abstract. In practice, it raises uncomfortable questions. Who designs the culture? Who decides which values are embedded and which are suppressed? What happens to dissent? What are the mechanisms for updating the cultural framework when it stops working or when it produces injustice without dismantling the mission coherence that the culture was built to maintain? These are not hypothetical concerns. They are the central questions of political philosophy, applied to an environment where the stakes of getting them wrong are civilizational. The second approach is radical transparency. Rather than managing the psychological challenge of the interstellar middle generations through cultural embedding, some researchers argue for the opposite, telling every generation with complete honesty exactly what their situation is, what the mission is, what it costs, what they are being asked to give up, and then trusting that informed human beings, given real understanding and real agency within the constraints of the situation, will find their own reasons to care. This approach has the virtue of respecting human dignity. It treats the people on the ship as adults capable of making meaning out of difficult circumstances, which, to be fair, is exactly what human beings have always done. Every generation that has ever lived has faced constraints it didn't choose: the accident of birth, the historical moment, the physical and social environment that shaped their options. People make meaning within constraints. They always have. The question is whether the specific constraints of a generation ship are too severe, too total, too inescapable for that natural human capacity to operate. The third approach, and this one is perhaps the most philosophically interesting, is to reframe the mission entirely. Instead of defining the purpose of the ship as reaching a destination, define it as being a way of life. The ship is not a vehicle, it is a home. The journey is not a means to an end, it is the thing itself. The people on the ship are not waiting to live their real lives when they arrive. They are living them now, fully, in this specific place, with these specific people, in this specific moment of the longest human journey ever undertaken. This is not spin, it is a genuine philosophical reorientation, one with deep roots in human tradition. Many cultures throughout history have placed more value on the quality of the journey than the nature of the destination. Stoic philosophy, certain Buddhist traditions, indigenous philosophies of relationship with place, all contain versions of the idea that the meaning of a life is found in how it is lived, not in what it ultimately achieves. Applied to a generation ship, this reorientation might be the most psychologically honest way to help people find genuine peace with circumstances they cannot change. But peace is not the only challenge. Let's talk about governance. Because a sealed society of thousands of people, with no external authority to appeal to and no exit available, faces governance challenges that make the politics of any Earth-based nation look manageable by comparison. Every human society ever studied has developed some form of hierarchy, some mechanism for distributing power, resolving conflicts, making collective decisions, and enforcing the rules that make social life possible. These mechanisms take wildly different forms across cultures and historical periods, from small-scale egalitarian band societies to complex bureaucratic states, but the underlying need they serve is universal. People living together need ways of deciding things together, and when those ways fail or are perceived as illegitimate, the result is conflict. On a generation ship, the political stakes of conflict are uniquely high. On Earth, political instability, even at its most catastrophic, does not typically threaten the physical survival of the planet. The atmosphere keeps breathing, the sun keeps shining, the oceans keep circulating. The basic infrastructure of life continues regardless of what human political systems do to each other. On a ship, the infrastructure of life is the ship, the life support systems, the agricultural systems, the water recycling systems, the radiation shielding, the navigation computers. These are not background conditions. They are actively maintained systems that require human attention, cooperation, and competence to keep running. A serious political breakdown, a civil conflict, a factional power struggle that damages critical systems, a governing authority that loses legitimacy and cannot enforce the maintenance schedules that keep everyone alive, is not just a social crisis. It is a survival crisis. This means that the governance system of a generation ship must be, above all, resilient. It must be designed to absorb conflict, and there will be conflict, because there are always people who disagree, always competing interests, always grievances both legitimate and imagined, without allowing that conflict to cascade into threats to the physical infrastructure of survival. It must have mechanisms for peaceful transfer of power, for legitimate dissent, for reform. It must be robust enough to function even when the people running it are imperfect, as people always are. It must also, and this is the part that no political theorist has fully solved, remain legitimate in the eyes of people who were born into it and never chose it. The social contract, in traditional political theory, is an agreement between individuals and the society they belong to. But you cannot make an agreement with a society you were born into before you could consent. Every generation born on the ship is, in a legal and philosophical sense, drafted into a mission they never signed up for. The political system must somehow earn the ongoing consent of people who had no say in its founding terms. while also maintaining the coherence and discipline needed to keep a civilization-scale life support system running for centuries. No one has solved this, not even close. But the attempts to think through it, the papers, the models, the speculative frameworks, are among the most interesting documents in contemporary social science. And then there is the question of knowledge, of education, of what gets preserved and what gets lost across the span of generations in an isolated environment. A generation ship carries, at launch, the sum of human knowledge that its designers could fit in its databases and its library systems. Every scientific paper, every cultural work, every engineering manual, every medical reference, every philosophical text, all of it preserved in digital form, accessible in principle to anyone on the ship. But digital preservation is not the same as living knowledge. The difference between knowing that a document about nuclear pulse propulsion exists in the database and actually having engineers on board who understand nuclear pulse propulsion well enough to maintain it, troubleshoot it, and adapt it to unexpected problems. That difference is the difference between a civilization and an archive. Knowledge, real working knowledge, lives in people. It lives in the specific skills and intuitions and hard-won understanding that develop when human beings spend years doing difficult things and learning from the doing. And it is transmitted not primarily through documents, but through apprenticeship, through the slow, inefficient, irreplaceable process of experienced people passing their understanding to less experienced ones through direct interaction and practice. On a generation ship, maintaining this kind of living knowledge across centuries requires an educational system of extraordinary intentionality and depth. Every critical skill, every branch of engineering, medicine, agriculture, navigation, and systems maintenance that the ship depends on must be actively taught to sufficient numbers of people in every generation to ensure that the expertise never dies with a single individual or cohort. The ship cannot afford intellectual bottlenecks. It cannot afford the equivalent of a medieval dark age, a period where critical knowledge is lost and must be painfully reconstructed. Because on a ship in interstellar space, some knowledge once lost cannot be reconstructed from scratch. The consequences of losing it are not a slowdown in civilizational progress. They are death. There is so much more to unpack here. We haven't yet talked about what happens to the human body specifically over the timescales of a century-long voyage, the accumulated effects of cosmic radiation, of artificial gravity imperfections, of a diet grown in closed-loop systems rather than evolved alongside us over millions of years. We haven't talked about reproduction, about how a society deliberately manages population size and genetic diversity without crossing into territory that history has shown to be catastrophically dangerous. And we haven't talked about what happens at the other end when the ship finally arrives, when a population that has been culturally, psychologically, and biologically shaped by a century of confinement has to become something entirely different, pioneers on an alien world. That transition from ship to planet is one of the most underexplored and genuinely fascinating parts of this entire scenario, and it is where we are headed next. Let's talk about your body. Not in the abstract, not as a philosophical concept or a sociological unit, but as the specific biological evolved machine that you are. The one built over millions of years of natural selection on the surface of a planet with a specific gravity, a specific atmospheric composition, a specific radiation environment, and a specific relationship with a yellow star 93 million miles away. The one that is, in almost every meaningful sense, a product of Earth, calibrated for Earth, optimized imperfectly but remarkably for life on this particular world. Now put that body on a ship, seal the hatch, and ask it to function, not for a month, not for a year, not for the 6-month rotations that astronauts on the International Space Station manage with careful exercise regimens and medical monitoring, and the knowledge that Earth is close enough to return to in an emergency. Ask it to function for a century, for multiple generations, in an environment that mimics what it needs approximately, but is not and never will be the thing it was built for. What happens? The answer, built from decades of space medicine research and extrapolated carefully across the timescales involved, is both more survivable and more alarming than most people expect. And it starts with the most pervasive, most unavoidable physical threat in interstellar space, one that has no complete solution with current or near-future technology, radiation. On Earth, you are protected from the most damaging forms of cosmic radiation by two overlapping shields. The first is the planet's magnetic field, a vast, invisible bubble generated by the movement of molten iron in Earth's outer core, deflecting charged particles from the Sun and from deep space before they can reach the surface. The second is the atmosphere, roughly 10 tons of air per square meter of surface, thick enough to absorb and scatter most of the high-energy particles that make it past the magnetic field. Together, these two systems reduce your annual radiation dose to a level that your DNA repair mechanisms can handle with reasonable efficiency over the course of a normal human lifespan. Strip both of those away, as you do the moment you leave Earth, and the radiation environment changes dramatically. In low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station operates, astronauts receive roughly 10 times the radiation dose of someone on the surface. Beyond the protection of Earth's magnetic field entirely, in the deep space environment between planets, the dose increases further. And in interstellar space, beyond even the faint protection of the heliosphere, the bubble of solar wind that extends to roughly 100 astronomical units from our Sun, the dominant radiation source shifts from solar particles to galactic cosmic rays. High-energy atomic nuclei, primarily protons and helium nuclei, but also heavier elements, accelerated to near light speed by supernovae and other violent events across the galaxy, streaming through interstellar space from every direction simultaneously. There is no shielding against them that doesn't come with crippling mass penalties. Lead blocks them, but the mass of lead required to meaningfully reduce the dose rate for a large crew would add so much weight to the ship that the propulsion requirements become practically impossible. Water shielding is more mass efficient and seriously proposed. The ship's water supply positioned around the crew quarters to provide some protection, but it is partial at best against the highest energy particles. The long-term health consequences of sustained cosmic ray exposure are not fully characterized because no human being has ever experienced them at the levels and durations involved in an interstellar crossing. What we do know from studies of astronauts and from research using particle accelerators to simulate cosmic ray effects in animal models is sobering. Elevated cancer risk is the most straightforward concern. Cosmic rays damage DNA in ways that the body's repair mechanisms can handle for short exposures, but that accumulate dangerously over years. But the research on cognitive effects is in some ways more alarming. Studies using mice exposed to cosmic ray simulations have found measurable impairments in learning, memory, and what researchers describe as context discrimination, the ability to distinguish between safe and dangerous situations. The mechanisms involve direct damage to neurons and to the myelin sheaths that insulate nerve fibers, as well as neuroinflammatory responses that the brain mounts against radiation damage and that turn out, over time, to be damaging in their own right. What this means for a crew living in space for decades or centuries is genuinely uncertain. But it means that cognitive decline, not dramatic, not sudden, but gradual, cumulative, and potentially significant, is a real biological risk that any generation ship mission must take seriously. and a society that depends on the accumulated wisdom and competence of its oldest and most experienced members cannot afford a population in which cognitive function declines systematically with age at a faster rate than on Earth. Beyond radiation, there is the question of gravity. We touched on this in part 1, but let's go deeper, because the biological implications over multi-generational timescales are more profound than the engineering challenge of building a rotating habitat. Assume, for the sake of argument, that the generation ship does have a rotating section that produces something close to Earth normal gravity, roughly 9.8 meters per second squared, the acceleration that keeps your blood in your legs and your bones dense and your vestibular system oriented and your cardiovascular system working at the pressure gradients it evolved for. Even with this, the match between the ship's artificial gravity and the gravity your biology was built for is imperfect. The Coriolis effect, the apparent deflection of moving objects in a rotating reference frame, is present in any rotating habitat, and its intensity depends on the radius of rotation and the rotation rate. A small, fast-spinning habitat produces a Coriolis effect strong enough to cause nausea, disorientation, and balance problems. A large, slow-spinning one minimizes these effects but requires an engineering scale that is, to put it mildly, ambitious. But here is the deeper question, the one that generation ship researchers find most genuinely unsettling when they think about it carefully. What happens to the human body and the human genome after not one but several generations in an environment that is close to Earth normal but not identical? Evolution works on timescales of thousands to millions of years, and the selective pressures of a generation ship, operating across perhaps 3 to 10 generations, are not long enough to produce new species. But epigenetic changes, heritable modifications to gene expression that don't alter the underlying DNA sequence, but do change which genes are active and when, can occur within a single generation and be passed to offspring. The epigenetic landscape of a population living in sustained low-level radiation, slightly imperfect artificial gravity, artificial light cycles, and a microbiome shaped by a closed-loop agricultural system rather than the wild diversity of Earth's ecological systems could diverge meaningfully from the epigenetic baseline of the founding population within just a few generations. We do not fully understand what that divergence would look like. The science of epigenetic inheritance in humans is still young and fiercely debated, but the possibility that the people who arrive at the destination are, in some measurable biological sense, different from the people who departed, not dramatically, not in ways visible to the naked eye, but in their baseline physiology, their immune responses, their metabolic set points, their neurological development, is real enough to take seriously. Let's talk about the microbiome, because this is one of the most underappreciated dimensions of the generation ship biology problem, and one where recent research has genuinely changed the picture. Your body is not just human cells. It is a partnership, a dense, ancient, extraordinarily complex community of microorganisms that live on your skin, in your gut, in your respiratory tract, in every moist surface of your body. The human microbiome, the collective genome of all these microorganisms, contains roughly 100 times as many genes as the human genome itself. These microorganisms are not passengers. They are participants. They digest food components that human enzymes cannot process. They synthesize vitamins, including vitamin K and several B vitamins, that are essential to human health. They train and regulate the immune system. They communicate with the nervous system via the gut-brain axis in ways that influence mood, anxiety, and cognitive function. The composition of your gut microbiome has been linked in research over the past 2 decades to conditions ranging from inflammatory bowel disease to depression to obesity to autism spectrum disorder. On Earth, The microbiome is constantly refreshed and diversified by contact with the environment, the soil, the plants, the animals, the water, the air, the other people we touch and breathe near. This constant environmental input keeps the microbiome diverse, which is generally associated with better health outcomes. Strip that environmental input away, seal a population into a ship with a fixed, finite microbial ecosystem, and the microbiome begins to simplify. The diversity that comes from constant contact with a rich, varied natural environment is replaced by the diversity, or lack of it, available within the ship's closed system. Over generations, as the microbial ecosystem of the ship evolves in isolation from Earth's biosphere, the microbiome of the ship's human population evolves with it. The partnership between human and microorganism, calibrated over millions of years of shared evolution on the surface of one specific planet, is placed in an environment that neither partner was built for. The long-term health implications are genuinely unknown, but the research on the consequences of reduced microbiome diversity on Earth is not encouraging. Now let's talk about reproduction. Because on a generation ship, reproduction is not just a personal decision, it is, in the most direct possible sense, a civilizational one. We established in Part 1 that the minimum viable population for a multi-generational interstellar voyage, accounting for genetic drift, disease, and accident, is somewhere in the range of 10,000 to 40,000 individuals, according to the most rigorous current estimates. Maintaining that population across a century or more of travel requires that births roughly balance deaths, that the population neither grows so fast that it overwhelms the ship's food and life support capacity, nor shrinks so much that genetic diversity collapses and the mission becomes biologically unviable. This means that reproduction on a generation ship cannot be entirely a private matter. The ship must have, in some form, a population management system, a set of norms, incentives, or rules that shapes reproductive behavior at the population level without crossing into coercion. The history of human attempts to deliberately manage population composition and reproduction is, to put it gently, not a happy one. Eugenics programs of the 20th century caused enormous suffering and left deep scars on the ethics of genetics and medicine. The generation ship mission cannot afford to repeat those mistakes, but it also cannot afford to ignore the population genetics reality that its mission depends on. Some researchers have proposed that sperm and egg banks, a large, genetically diverse frozen collection maintained throughout the voyage, could serve as a kind of genetic buffer. If the living population begins to show signs of genetic bottlenecking, the frozen genetic material could be used to introduce diversity without requiring changes to the social norms around reproduction. This approach is technically feasible. Cryogenic preservation of reproductive cells is well established, but it raises profound ethical questions about the rights of people born from stored genetic material, the governance of the bank, and the power dynamics involved in decisions about whose genetic material is used and when. Others have proposed that advances in artificial wombs and genetic screening could allow the ship to maintain genetic diversity through technological rather than social means, screening embryos for diversity before implantation, growing some portion of each generation in artificial wombs using the banked genetic material, supplementing the naturally born population with what might be called deliberately designed cohorts. The ethics of this are even more complex and contested, but the population genetics problem is real, and any serious proposal for a generation ship mission must have a serious answer to it. Let's pause on something that doesn't get talked about enough in these conversations. Something that is not a technical problem or a governance challenge, but a deeply human one. What does it mean to be born into a purpose you did not choose? Every person alive on Earth was born into circumstances they did not choose. A country, a culture, a family, a socio-economic position, a historical moment. None of us consented to the terms of our existence before we existed to consent. And yet most of us find over the course of a life that the circumstances we were born into are not a prison, but a context, the specific, irreplaceable context within which we build a self and find a meaning that feels genuinely our own. The question for the generation ship is whether the specific context of being born on a vessel in interstellar space, in a society built around a mission you did not choose, heading toward a destination you will not live to see, whether that context is one within which a human being can genuinely flourish, not just survive, not just function, but flourish, develop the full range of human potential, find genuine meaning and connection and joy, live a life that feels worth living on its own terms, rather than only as an instrument of the mission. The honest answer is, we don't know. There is no data. There has never been a generation ship. The closest analogues, isolated island communities, long-duration Antarctic expeditions, closed religious communities, prison populations over generations, are all imperfect comparisons. Each of them differs from the generation ship scenario in ways that make direct extrapolation unreliable. What we can say is this: human beings are among the most adaptable organisms on this planet. We have thrived in deserts and in Arctic tundra, in dense tropical forests and on high-altitude plateaus, in nomadic bands and in cities of 20 million people. The range of environments and social structures within which human beings have found meaning and built cultures that their members experienced as worth belonging to is vast. The generation ship is an extreme point on that spectrum, but it is not necessarily beyond it. What it would require, and this is where the research converges, is intentional design. Not just of the physical systems, but of the social and psychological ones, the culture, the education, the governance, the rituals, the stories, the mechanisms for managing conflict and transmitting purpose across generations. All of it would need to be designed with as much care and rigor as the propulsion system and the life support. Perhaps more, because the propulsion system failing kills the mission quickly and obviously. A cultural system failing kills it slowly, across generations, in ways that may not be visible until it is too late to correct. We are building toward the moment of arrival, and it is stranger and more complicated than you might think, because the people who step off the ship at the end of the journey are not the same people, not biologically, not psychologically, not culturally, as the people who stepped onto it generations earlier. They have been shaped by a century of confinement, of artificial environment, of a specific social structure, of a microbiome evolved in a closed system, of a radiation exposure that has left its marks in their cells and possibly in their cognition, and now we are asking them to survive on an alien world, to breathe, or not breathe, its air, to build shelter against its weather, to find food in an ecosystem that evolved without them, that has its own chemistry, its own pathogens, its own selective pressures that have nothing to do with anything in the human evolutionary history. The transition from ship to planet, from the controlled, artificial, carefully maintained environment of the generation ship to the wild, unpredictable, genuinely alien surface of a world orbiting another star, is one of the most extraordinary transitions imaginable. And we haven't even begun to talk about it properly yet. That is exactly where we are going next. The landing, the first breath of alien air, or the decision not to breathe it. The first encounter with an ecology that has never seen anything like you, and the profound, disorienting, exhilarating reality of building a civilization from scratch on a world that was never yours and may not want you there. This is where the journey gets truly wild, and you are not going to want to miss it. If you are enjoying the video, make sure to subscribe to the channel Every day we go somewhere extraordinary together. You don't want to miss what is coming next. The ship is in orbit. After a century of travel, 100 years of recycled air and artificial light, and the quiet, endless hum of engines that nobody alive has ever heard stop, the destination is no longer a point of light in the forward cameras. It is a world, a real one, filling the viewports with color and texture and the specific, overwhelming reality of a place that is not the ship. Take a moment to sit with what that means. For every person alive on board at this moment, for the arrival generation, the people born into the final decades of the crossing, raised with the knowledge that they would be the ones to see this. The view outside the window is the first genuinely new thing any human being on this ship has seen in a century. Everything else in their lives has been the ship, the same corridors, the same growing bays, the same common areas, the same artificial sky, the same finite, known, thoroughly mapped interior of a vessel that has been home to every person they have ever met, and now this, a planet. Clouds moving across its surface in patterns driven by a weather system that has never once been influenced by a human decision. Light from a star that is not our sun, reflecting off an atmosphere whose composition has been analyzed from orbit, but whose smell, whose texture, whose specific quality of silence or sound, none of that is known yet. None of it has ever been experienced by a human being. The arrival generation grew up knowing this moment was coming. They were educated for it, psychologically prepared for it, culturally oriented toward it in every story and ritual and educational framework the ship's society had developed over a century of deliberate cultural maintenance. And still, nothing in any preparation could have fully bridged the gap between knowing this moment would come and actually being inside it. The question now is not whether they arrived. They did, against extraordinary odds, across an almost incomprehensible distance, through a century of biological and psychological and social challenges that no generation ship designer could have fully anticipated. They made it. The question is what comes next, and it is, in almost every dimension, the hardest part of the entire endeavor. Let's start with the atmosphere, because before anyone opens a hatch, before anyone even seriously considers setting foot on the surface, the question of what is in the air outside is not just important, it is everything. Earth's atmosphere is a specific mixture, roughly 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, with trace amounts of argon, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and various other gases. The partial pressure of oxygen at sea level, the specific pressure at which oxygen molecules are available to bind to hemoglobin in your red blood cells, is calibrated by millions of years of evolution to exactly what your respiratory system needs. Too little oxygen and you suffocate. Too much and you risk oxygen toxicity, seizures, lung damage, eventually death. The atmospheric pressure itself matters, too. At low pressures, the boiling point of water drops below body temperature, which produces effects in the human body that are rapidly lethal. The planet orbiting the destination star is not Earth. Even if its bulk atmospheric composition is broadly similar, even if the remote sensing data collected during the approach shows oxygen and nitrogen in roughly the right proportions, which would itself be an extraordinary and significant finding, the details matter enormously. The partial pressure of oxygen, the presence of trace gases that might be harmless in small concentrations or toxic in larger ones, the atmospheric pressure at the surface, the presence of biological pathogens, microorganisms evolved in a completely different biosphere against which the human immune system has no prior experience and no pre-existing defenses. This last point deserves to be held carefully. The history of what happens when human populations encounter pathogens their immune systems have never seen is not a comforting one. When Europeans arrived in the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries, the diseases they carried, smallpox, measles, influenza devastated indigenous populations whose immune systems had no prior exposure to these pathogens. Estimates of the death toll vary, but many historians place it at somewhere between 50 and 90% of the pre-contact population in the most severely affected regions. This was not a consequence of malice or deliberate weaponization in most cases. It was the straightforward, brutal biology of immune systems encountering novel pathogens for the first time. Now consider the reverse scenario. A human population arriving at a world with its own biosphere, its own ecosystem of microorganisms, its own viruses and bacteria and fungi, evolved over billions of years in a completely independent biological history. The human immune system, sophisticated as it is, was built to recognize and respond to pathogens from Earth's biosphere. Its pattern recognition, the molecular shapes it has learned through evolutionary history to identify as foreign and dangerous, is calibrated to Earth life. An alien microorganism built from different molecular building blocks or using familiar building blocks in unfamiliar configurations might be completely invisible to human immune defenses, or it might trigger catastrophic immune responses, the kind where the immune system's attempt to fight an unfamiliar threat causes more damage than the threat itself. Or, and this is an equally real possibility that often gets overlooked in these conversations, the alien microorganisms might have no interest in human biology whatsoever. Life that evolved in a completely independent biochemical context might simply not recognize human cells as a substrate worth exploiting. The molecular keys that pathogens use to enter and replicate within cells are highly specific. They are shaped by millions of years of coevolution with their hosts. An alien pathogen might simply lack the molecular tools to interact with human biology in any meaningful way, the way a key designed for one lock cannot open another. The honest answer is that we don't know which of these scenarios would apply, and not knowing, in this specific context, with this specific population, means that the protocols for first contact with an alien biosphere must be designed around worst-case assumptions. So what do those protocols actually look like? The first phase is remote, orbital observation, atmospheric sampling via unmanned probes, surface sampling from landing drones that return sealed canisters to the ship for analysis in a dedicated containment laboratory. The same kind of rigorous, conservative, evidence-first approach that we discussed in the context of sample return from Proxima Centauri in the previous series. Before any human being sets foot on the surface, the arrival generation needs the most complete possible picture of what is down there. Atmospheric chemistry, surface mineralogy, the presence or absence of biological activity, the nature of that activity if it exists. This phase takes time, months probably, maybe years. And here is where the psychological dimension of the arrival intersects with the scientific one in a way that mission planners must take seriously. The arrival generation has waited their entire lives for this. Their parents waited. Their grandparents waited. The people who boarded the ship 100 years ago gave up everything: Earth, family, the open sky, the wild diversity of a living planet, for this moment. And now the scientists and the mission commanders are saying, wait a little longer, stay in the ship, let the drones go first. That tension between the hunger to arrive and the discipline required to arrive safely is one of the most human dimensions of this entire scenario. And history suggests it is not always resolvable through reason alone. The explorers who rushed ashore before the all-clear had been given, the researchers who bypassed safety protocols because the moment felt too significant to slow down for procedure, these are not exceptional cases, they are patterns. Managing the emotional urgency of a population that has been waiting for a century within the constraints of protocols designed for their survival requires governance and cultural systems that can hold both things simultaneously. Assume, for the sake of continuing the journey, that the orbital and drone survey phase is completed, that the data has been collected, the atmospheric chemistry analyzed, the surface map, the biological indicators, whatever they are, catalogued and debated and argued over in the ship's scientific community for long enough that a consensus has emerged, not certainty. Science rarely delivers certainty, but enough evidence to make a provisional decision. And the decision is to send people down. The first landing party is small, not because the planet can't support more, but because the first landing is not a colonization event. It is a reconnaissance mission. The people who descend in the first landing craft are scientists, medics, and engineers, selected not just for their expertise, but for their psychological profiles, their ability to function under extreme novelty, their capacity to observe and record and report without being overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they are experiencing. They descend through an atmosphere that the sensors say is breathable, not identical to Earth's, but within the range that human physiology can handle, at least in the short term. They are wearing suits regardless. The suits stay on until a longer exposure period in a controlled environment has confirmed that the atmosphere poses no immediate biological threat. This is protocol. This is discipline. This is the difference between a mission that survives first contact and one that doesn't. The landing craft touches down. The surface, seen through the viewport, is not what any of them expected, because no matter how detailed the orbital surveys, no matter how many drone images have been transmitted back to the ship, nothing prepares you for the specific, immediate, physical reality of a place. The color of the light filtered through this specific atmosphere from this specific star is different from anything in the ship's entire century of artificial illumination. The texture of the ground, rock, or something like rock in colors that the eye wants to categorize as familiar and can't quite, is visible through the viewport. The horizon for the first time in 100 years is not a curved wall but an actual horizon, flat, extending to a distance that the human visual system, calibrated for the confined spaces of the ship, struggles at first to process. Someone in the landing party cries. Of course they do. They were born on a ship. They have never in their lives had a horizon. The first step onto the surface, when it comes, after the decontamination protocols and the atmosphere checks and the soil sampling and all the careful, disciplined science that precedes it, is not like the moon landing. It is not a moment of national triumph broadcast to a watching world. There is no watching world. The signal carrying the images of this moment will take years to reach Earth, and the Earth that receives it will be a different place from the one the founding generation left. The people watching, if the broadcast infrastructure still exists, if the mission is still remembered with the clarity and urgency it had at launch, will be the great-grandchildren of the people who said goodbye at the launch facility. The first step is something more intimate than a triumph. It is a completion, the closing of a loop that was opened a century ago by people who are dust now, whose names are known to every child on the ship because the culture has kept them alive, whose decisions set in motion a chain of births and deaths and ordinary days and extraordinary moments that ends here, in this specific footprint on alien ground, in the specific weight of a human body on a world that has never felt one before. The soil, according to the instruments, contains complex chemistry. Not biological, not clearly, not yet, but complex, interesting. The kind of chemistry that on Earth would precede biology in the sequence of events we call abiogenesis, or the kind that might be the remnant of biology that existed once and no longer does, or the kind that is simply what happens to carbon-rich chemistry under the specific radiation and temperature conditions of this particular planetary surface. The scientists in the landing party note everything, record everything, disturb as little as possible. They are guests here in the way that a careful scientist is always as a guest in the environment they are studying, present to observe, not to impose. Back on the ship, the population is watching the feed from the landing party's suit cameras. Every screen in every common area is showing the same images: the alien ground, the alien sky, the alien light. Children who have never seen a horizon are seeing one for the first time through a camera feed, and the experience is still, somehow, adequate to produce something real in them. Something that has no word in the ship's inherited language, but that every one of them recognizes. Something like arrival, something like permission. The permission to believe that the thing they were born into was real, was worth it, is actually happening. This moment, this collective, ship-wide, generational exhale, is perhaps the most important moment in the entire mission, not because of what is discovered or what is built in the hours and days that follow, but because of what it does to the social fabric of the ship. For a century, the mission has been an abstraction for most of the people living it, a story they were told, a purpose they were assigned, a destination they could not feel in their bodies because their bodies had never experienced anything but the ship. Now it is real, visibly, undeniably, on every screen in every common area, undeniably real. The founding generation's gamble has paid off. The middle generation's sacrifice, the ordinary lives lived in service of an extraordinary purpose, was not wasted. The arrival generation, standing on alien ground and staring at an alien horizon, has justified all of it. That is a powerful thing, powerful enough. Researchers who study human motivation and social cohesion believe to sustain a community through the next extraordinary challenge, which begins immediately, because arriving is not the end. It is the beginning of something harder in many ways than the crossing. Building a civilization from scratch on an alien world with a population shaped by a century of confinement, that is what the arrival generation now faces. And the assets they have are extraordinary: a ship full of technology, a culture shaped by intentional design to be resilient and purposeful, a scientific and engineering knowledge base maintained with extraordinary care across 100 years of deliberate education. And the challenges they face are equally extraordinary. The planet's biology, if it has biology, is not their biology. The planet's chemistry is not their chemistry. The soil may or may not support the agricultural systems developed in the ship's closed-loop growing bays. The local pathogens, if they exist, are unknown quantities. The weather, the seasonal cycles, the specific hazards of this particular planetary surface, all of it must be learned from scratch by people who have never in their lives dealt with weather, with seasons, with the unpredictable, uncontrollable complexity of a real ecosystem. And the ship, the home that every person alive on it was born in, the only world any of them has ever known, cannot stay in orbit forever. Eventually, it must be dismantled, its resources used for the surface settlement that is the mission's final objective. The ship is not the destination, it was never the destination. But for the arrival generation, it is home in a way that the planet, however beautiful and however significant, is not yet. And asking people to dismantle their home, even in service of the mission their entire existence has been oriented around, is asking something real and difficult and emotionally complex. This tension between the ship as home and the planet as destiny is one of the most genuinely human moments in the entire generation ship scenario, and it is one that mission planners, for all their careful design of governance systems and cultural frameworks and population genetics protocols, may not have fully anticipated, because it is not a technical problem, it is a grief. The grief of leaving the only home you have ever known for a world that does not yet feel like one, and that grief, real, legitimate, worthy of acknowledgement, is what the arrival generation carries with them as they take those first steps, as they begin the long, unglamorous, extraordinary work of turning an alien world into something that might, one day, feel like home, but we still haven't answered the original question, the one the title of this video promised to address. Not just whether they could survive the crossing, they did, in the scenario we've been tracing, but how long, under what conditions, at what cost, and whether, knowing everything we now know about the biological, psychological, social and civilizational challenges involved, a generation ship is something that the human species could actually pull off, not in a best case, everything goes right scenario, but in the real world, with real human beings and real human institutions and all the magnificent, infuriating, irreducible complexity that implies that reckoning is coming, and it requires us to look at the scenarios where things go wrong, not catastrophically, not the meteor strike or the reactor failure or the dramatic crisis that science fiction loves, the slow failures, the gradual drifts, the ways that a society under sustained extraordinary pressure can lose its way not in a single dramatic moment, but across decades of small decisions and accumulated consequences. Because those are the failures that are hardest to prevent, hardest to detect, and most instructive about what it would actually take to do this right. That is where we are headed next. And it is the most important part of this conversation. Here is something that doesn't get talked about enough when people imagine catastrophic failure. The dramatic endings, the hull breach, the reactor meltdown, the collision with an uncharted object in the dark between stars. Those are the failures that get written into science fiction because they are vivid and immediate and make for compelling narrative. But they are also, in a well-engineered system with sufficient redundancy and a technically competent crew, among the more preventable kinds of failure. You can design against them. You can build redundant systems, run simulations, establish emergency protocols, train people to respond. The engineering of catastrophic failure prevention is hard, but it is a known category of hard. It has a shape that engineers recognize and know how to approach. The failures that actually worry the researchers who think most carefully about generation ships are not the dramatic ones. They are the slow ones, the invisible ones, the ones that don't announce themselves with alarms and flashing lights, but instead accumulate quietly across decades, in the space between policy decisions and cultural shifts and individual choices that each seem minor in isolation and become devastating in combination. These are the failures of the human system, and they are, by their nature, the hardest to design against, because human systems are not engineering systems. They do not fail in predictable ways. They fail in the ways that human beings fail, through short-sightedness, through factionalism, through the gradual erosion of shared purpose, through the specific, irreducible tendency of people in power to prioritize their own continuation in power over the long-term health of the system they are supposed to be serving. Let's trace some of these failure modes, not as predictions, because the future is not determined and good design can prevent many of them, but as warnings, as the specific shapes of risk that anyone seriously thinking about a generation ship mission needs to understand. The first failure mode is what systems theorists call institutional calcification. It works like this. At launch, the ship's governance system is designed to be adaptive. The founders understand, or should understand, that they cannot anticipate everything, that the specific challenges the mission will face across a century cannot be fully predicted from the launch pad, that the institutions they build must have mechanisms for reform, for responding to new information, for updating their rules and structures as circumstances change. This is easy to say at the beginning, when the founding generation is alive and present, and the institutions are fresh, and the mission is immediate and real. But institutions have a natural tendency towards self-preservation. The people who benefit from a particular power structure have an interest in maintaining it, The rules that were designed to be adaptive become, over time, traditions, and traditions become sacred, and sacred things become resistant to change, even when the circumstances that created them have long since evolved. The governance system that was designed to be flexible starts to harden. The mechanisms for reform that existed on paper become ceremonial, still technically available but practically inaccessible, surrounded by layers of procedural complexity that protect the status quo from challenge. On Earth, this process happens in every institution, in every country, across every era of human history. It is one of the most reliably documented patterns in political science and organizational sociology. On Earth, the consequences of institutional calcification are serious, but usually not fatal. External pressures, competing institutions, the simple fact that people can leave and join different social systems all provide mechanisms that prevent any single calcified institution from becoming permanent. Revolution, reform, collapse, and rebuilding, these are the Earth-level responses to institutional failure, and they are brutal and costly, but ultimately corrective. On a generation ship, none of those corrective mechanisms exist in the same form. You cannot leave. There is no competing institution to defect to. Revolution, actual physical conflict between factions over control of the ship's systems, is not just a political failure but a potential civilizational one, because the systems being fought over are the same systems keeping everyone alive. The corrective mechanisms that Earth societies rely on are either unavailable or catastrophically expensive on a generation ship, which means that institutional calcification, if it is not actively prevented from the beginning through deliberate structural design, has the potential to lock a ship's population into governance arrangements that serve an increasingly narrow group of people across generations with no external pressure sufficient to break the cycle. The second failure mode is knowledge stratification, and it is subtler than institutional calcification, but potentially just as dangerous. We talked about the challenge of maintaining living knowledge, the specific working, hands-on understanding of critical systems across multiple generations. The challenge is not just keeping the knowledge alive in documents, it is keeping it alive in people, and this requires an educational system of extraordinary intentionality, one that actively directs sufficient numbers of people into the technical disciplines the ship depends on in every generation. What happens when that intentionality slips? When the educational system, under the pressures of whatever social dynamics have developed inside the ship over decades, begins to reflect the interests of the governing class rather than the functional needs of the mission. When the children of the powerful receive broad, prestigious, governance-oriented educations, while the children of the less powerful are channeled into the technical maintenance roles that the ship needs, but that the cultural hierarchy has come to regard as lower status. This is not a hypothetical dynamic. It is one of the most persistent patterns in human social organization, the tendency of educational systems to reproduce existing social hierarchies rather than to allocate human talent to where it is most needed. On Earth, this tendency produces inequality and wasted human potential, which are serious problems. On a generation ship, it produces something additionally dangerous, a gradual accumulation of technical knowledge in a shrinking class of specialists, creating fragility in the systems that everyone depends on. Fragility in a complex system is not visible until it becomes catastrophic. The ship functions, the lights come on, the water is recycled, the crops grow. But the number of people who genuinely understand how each of these systems works, who could diagnose a novel failure mode, design an improvised solution, train the next generation of maintainers is quietly declining. The specialists who remain are increasingly overworked, increasingly precious, increasingly difficult to replace when they age out or die unexpectedly. The redundancy that the mission designers built into the knowledge base at launch is being slowly consumed by a social dynamic that nobody is monitoring carefully enough, because the lights are still on and the water is still flowing and everything looks fine from the outside until it doesn't. And by then, the knowledge needed to fix the problem may no longer exist in sufficient depth among the living population of the ship. The third failure mode is purpose erosion. We touched on this a while ago, but let's go deeper, because purpose erosion is not simply a matter of people losing interest in the mission. It is a more complex, more insidious process than that. Human beings don't just need purpose. They need purpose that feels authentic, that feels like their own, rather than something imposed on them from outside. A purpose that is genuinely internalized, that lives in the individual's sense of identity and meaning, rather than in the external rules and penalties of the governance system, is remarkably durable. People do extraordinary things, endure extraordinary hardships, sustain extraordinary commitments for purposes they have genuinely made their own. The history of human achievement in science, in art, in exploration, in the quiet everyday heroism of people who raise children and build communities and care for one another across difficult circumstances, is fundamentally a history of internalized purpose. But a purpose that is externally imposed, that is maintained through social pressure and institutional authority rather than through genuine individual conviction, is fragile. It holds as long as the external pressure holds. The moment the pressure weakens, or is perceived as illegitimate, or is outweighed by competing pressures, it collapses. And the more generations that have passed since the purpose was originally adopted by people who genuinely chose it, the harder it becomes to maintain authentic internalization rather than hollow performance. This is the specific danger of purpose erosion on a generation ship. The founding generation chose. Their choice was real, costly, and deeply felt. Their purpose was authentic in the fullest sense. The first generation born on the ship grew up surrounded by the founders' genuine conviction, and many of them internalized it genuinely, the way children always tend to internalize the deepest values of the people who raised them. But with each passing generation, the social distance from the original authentic choice grows. The mission becomes more like a religion passed down through generations, present, powerful, shaping behavior, but increasingly maintained through cultural tradition and social enforcement, rather than through the direct felt personal conviction of the people performing it. And here is the thing about religion, maintained through tradition rather than conviction. It tends to develop a priesthood, a class of interpreters, people whose social status and power derive from their role as guardians of the tradition, who have a vested interest in the tradition remaining unchanged and in their interpretation of it remaining authoritative. On Earth, this dynamic has produced some of the most extraordinary institutions in human history and some of the most oppressive ones. On a generation ship, a mission priesthood, a class whose power comes from controlling the meaning of the mission, is not just a social inequality. It is a potential governance failure of the deepest kind. The fourth failure mode is what I want to call the horizon problem, and it is in some ways the most fundamentally human of all the challenges. Human motivation is powerfully shaped by the visible proximity of a goal. The neuroscience of reward and motivation, the dopamine systems that drive effort and sustain perseverance, are calibrated for a timescale of hours, days, weeks, years, not centuries. We are not built, neurologically or psychologically, to sustain effort toward a goal that is not just distant in time, but invisible in practice, a goal that no person alive will ever personally reach. This is the specific psychological structure of the generation ship's middle centuries. The destination is not receding, exactly. The ship is making progress every day, every decade. But the progress is invisible to human perception. The star ahead does not visibly grow from one year to the next in the way that a mountain grows as you hike toward it. The numbers in the navigation computers change, the distance decreases measurably if you look at the data, but numbers in a computer are not the same as felt progress. They do not trigger the reward pathways that make effort feel worthwhile. They do not sustain motivation the way that visible sensory evidence of approaching a goal does. What this means in practice is that every generation of people living in the ship's middle decades faces a motivational environment unlike any that human psychology evolved to handle. The goal is real, the progress is real, but neither can be experienced in the way that human reward systems require to sustain genuine engagement. The result, and this has been observed in every long-duration isolation study ever conducted, is a drift toward presentism, a psychological retreat from the long-term mission toward the immediate and the local. Relationships, small daily pleasures, the specific social dynamics of the immediate community, these become the de facto sources of meaning because they are the things that can actually be felt, that actually trigger the reward systems that make life feel worth living. This is not a failure. This is adaptive. This is human beings doing what human beings do, finding meaning in what is available to be found. But it exists in tension with the mission, a population deeply invested in the present, and the local may not allocate sufficient attention, resources, and social priority to the long-term systems and disciplines that the mission requires. Maintenance schedules are boring, educational rigor is demanding. The careful, unglamorous work of keeping a civilization-scale life support system running across centuries is not the kind of thing that presentism naturally prioritizes. Managing this tension between the psychological pull of the present and the mission demands of the future is perhaps the central governance challenge of a generation ship, and it is one for which no Earth-based institution, however sophisticated, provides a direct model, because no Earth-based institution has ever faced it at this scale and this duration. Let's talk about something that rarely comes up in the technical literature on generation ships, but that anyone who has spent time thinking about human societies will immediately recognize as critical boredom. Not the mild, temporary boredom of a slow afternoon, but the deep, structural boredom of a life in which the environment never fundamentally changes, in which genuine novelty is unavailable, in which the range of possible experiences is bounded by the walls of a ship that has been home to every person alive for their entire lives. Human beings are novelty-seeking organisms. Our brains are wired to find new information rewarding, the dopamine hit of discovery, of encountering something unexpected, of understanding something that was previously mysterious. This wiring is not incidental, it is adaptive. Curiosity and novelty-seeking drove the exploration of every new environment our species ever inhabited. It is in many ways the neurological engine of human progress. On a generation ship, the supply of genuine environmental novelty is finite and declining. At launch, everything is new: the ship itself, the experience of space, the specific social arrangements of the founding community. But by the third generation, by the fifth, by the 10th, the ship is thoroughly known. Every corridor, every compartment, every view from every viewport, every quirk of every system, the social landscape, the specific personalities and dynamics of a finite community is familiar in the way that a small town is familiar to someone who has lived there their entire life. Except that leaving is not an option. What do human beings do when the environment provides insufficient novelty? They create it. They manufacture drama, social conflict, political intrigue, religious controversy, artistic experimentation, whatever form of novel experience the available environment can support. Some of this is constructive, art, science, intellectual culture, the development of new social rituals and cultural forms. These are all ways of generating novelty within a constrained environment, and they can sustain genuine human flourishing over long periods. Some of it is destructive: manufactured conflict, factional politics, the elevation of minor disagreements into defining schisms. These are also ways of generating novelty, and they tend to emerge specifically when constructive channels are insufficient. The generation ship's cultural designers must take the novelty problem seriously, not just as a psychological welfare concern, but as a mission-critical systems issue. A population that cannot find sufficient constructive novelty will find destructive novelty. And on a ship where the same people, or their descendants, are sharing the same space for a century, destructive novelty has nowhere to go. Now here is something genuinely hopeful, because this conversation could easily tip into the conclusion that the generation ship is impossible, that the human, psychological, social, and biological challenges are simply too severe for any real mission to survive them, and that conclusion is not supported by what the research actually shows. What the research shows is more nuanced and more interesting. It shows that human beings, under the right conditions, with sufficient social support, genuine purpose, adequate physical environment, and meaningful agency over their own lives, are capable of sustaining extraordinary commitment and resilience over very long periods. The communities that have survived in isolation the longest on Earth are not the ones with the most sophisticated technology or the most comprehensive governance documents. They are the ones with the strongest cultures, the deepest shared stories, the most meaningful rituals, the most genuine sense of collective identity and purpose. And culture, unlike hardware, does not wear out. It does not require rare earth elements or precision manufacturing. It is carried in people, in the stories they tell each other, the songs they sing, the practices they maintain, the way they treat each other in ordinary moments and extraordinary ones. A culture strong enough to sustain a generation ship across a century of crossing is not beyond human capacity to build. We have built cultures that sustained communities across centuries of hardship before. We have built institutions that outlasted their founders by generations while maintaining meaningful continuity of purpose. What we have never done is build them deliberately from scratch with the specific purpose of sustaining a mission this extraordinary across this timescale. That is the genuinely novel challenge. Not whether it is possible, but whether we can learn to do it intentionally rather than hoping it emerges naturally. And that question about deliberate cultural design, about intentional civilization building, about whether we as a species are capable of designing our own social systems with sufficient foresight and wisdom to sustain them across the timescales that interstellar travel requires, is not just a question about generation ships. It is a question about us, about what we are capable of when we decide collectively that something matters enough to do carefully, about whether the same species that built cathedrals over centuries and mapped the human genome and landed robots on Mars can also build the social architecture for a century-long journey to another star. The answer to that question is not given to us by physics or engineering. It is given to us by history and by psychology and by the specific, stubborn, magnificent resilience that human communities have shown over and over again when the stakes were high enough and the culture was strong enough and the people were willing. It's not guaranteed, but it is not impossible. And in the space between those two positions lives everything that makes this question worth asking. We have one more enormous piece of this puzzle to address, the piece that ties everything together: the biology, the psychology, the governance, the culture, the arrival, and delivers a verdict. Not a simple yes or no, because the universe doesn't deal in simple answers, but a real, honest, scientifically grounded assessment of how long a generation ship society could actually survive under realistic conditions and what it would need to make it all the way. That is where we are going next. The reckoning, the numbers, the honest answer to the question we started with. Don't go anywhere, let's get honest. Not pessimistic, honest. Because there is a version of this conversation that stays comfortable, that keeps everything abstract and hypothetical and sufficiently far in the future that the hard questions never quite land with their full weight. And that version is not useful. It is not what you came here for. And it is not what the science actually supports. The honest version starts with a number, or rather, with several numbers, because the answer to how long a generation ship society could survive depends entirely on which variables you hold constant and which you allow to vary. And the range of those answers, from the optimistic end to the realistic middle to the sobering lower bound, tells you more about the nature of this challenge than any single figure could. Let's start at the optimistic end, because it is real and it matters and it deserves to be taken seriously before we work our way toward the more complicated middle. Under genuinely optimal conditions, a founding population of at least 10,000 genetically diverse individuals, a well-designed rotating habitat producing close to Earth normal gravity, a closed-loop life support system operating at high efficiency, a deliberately designed culture with robust mechanisms for transmitting purpose across generations, a governance system with genuine checks against calcification and abuse of power, an educational framework that maintains living technical knowledge in every generation, and a population that, through some combination of psychological resilience, cultural strength, and genuine collective commitment, manages the extraordinary challenge of sustained confinement without catastrophic social breakdown. Under those conditions, the research suggests that a generation ship society could survive the crossing not easily, not without cost, not without losses and crises and moments where the whole thing teeters, but survive in the sense that a population of human beings capable of fulfilling the mission arrives at the destination with sufficient numbers, sufficient genetic diversity, sufficient technical knowledge, and sufficient social cohesion to begin the work of establishing a presence on another world, the crossing to Proxima Centauri, at the most optimistic propulsion speeds that near-future technology might achieve, a sustained acceleration using nuclear pulse drive or a similar high-energy system would take somewhere between 80 and 140 years, depending on the specific velocity achieved and the deceleration profile at arrival. Call it roughly 100 years as a working figure. At human generational lengths of roughly 25 to 30 years per generation, that is 3 to 4 generations from launch to arrival. A number that is large but not impossibly so. There are institutions on Earth that have maintained meaningful continuity of purpose across 4 generations. Universities, religious orders, some family businesses, some nations, depending on how you define continuity. 4 generations is hard. It is the outer edge of what institutional memory can reliably bridge through living connection, through people who personally knew the founders. But it is not beyond what deliberate cultural design applied with sufficient rigor and wisdom might achieve. That is the optimistic end. And it is a real possibility, not guaranteed, not easy, but genuinely achievable in principle, given the right conditions. Now let's talk about the realistic middle. Because the optimistic scenario requires everything to go right, not perfectly, but directionally right, for a century, and everything going directionally right for a century in a human system is not the baseline expectation, it is the best case. The realistic middle acknowledges what we know about human institutions over long timescales, that they drift, that they stratify. that the people who accumulate power within them tend to use that power in ways that serve their own interests, and that mechanisms designed to prevent this tend to erode over time unless they are actively and consistently maintained. That cultures designed to transmit purpose across generations succeed partially. They keep the form of the mission alive, while the fire behind it dims slowly, in ways that are hard to measure and easy to rationalize. The realistic middle also acknowledges what we know about human biology under sustained non-Earth conditions. That cosmic ray exposure, even with the best available shielding, accumulates over a century in ways that current medicine cannot fully mitigate. That a microbiome sealed in a closed system for 4 generations will not be the same microbiome that boarded the ship, and the health implications of that divergence are genuinely uncertain. That the psychological toll of multi-generational confinement, transmitted through parenting and culture from one generation to the next, is real, even if its specific shape is hard to predict. In the realistic middle, the generation ship survives the crossing, but it arrives changed. The population that steps off the ship at the destination is smaller than the founding population, not because of any single catastrophe, but because of accumulated losses. Disease outbreaks that the closed-loop medical system managed but could not entirely prevent. Accidents that redundant engineering absorbed, but with irreplaceable human cost. Periods of reduced birth rates driven by the psychological pressures of the middle generations. Episodes of social conflict that the governance system contained, but not without damage. The genetic diversity of the arrival population is lower than ideal, not catastrophically so. Not enough to produce immediate health crises, but low enough to create vulnerabilities that will express themselves in the second and third generation of the surface settlement, when the consequences of the bottleneck begin to show up in health statistics and fertility data. The technical knowledge base is thinner than it should be. Not in the critical systems, the life support, the propulsion, the navigation. Those were prioritized because their failure would be immediately fatal, and therefore the governance system, even in its imperfect realistic middle form, could not afford to deprioritize them. But in the secondary and tertiary systems, the ones whose failure is slow and recoverable rather than fast and lethal, the knowledge has degraded. The understanding is shallower, the redundancy is lower. The arrival generation knows enough to keep the ship running, but not always enough to understand why what they are doing works. Which means that novel failure modes, the ones the original engineers didn't anticipate and didn't write protocols for, are harder to diagnose and solve. And the culture, the specific, deliberately designed cultural framework that was supposed to keep the mission alive across a century, has evolved. Not collapsed, not failed catastrophically, but drifted. The stories are still told, the rituals are still performed, the mission is still, in some official and socially enforced sense, the organizing purpose of the ship's society. But underneath the official story, in the lived reality of the people performing it, the relationship between individual identity and collective mission has become more complicated, more ambivalent, more layered with private reservations and quiet heresies that the cultural enforcement mechanisms have not quite succeeded in extinguishing. The arrival generation, in the realistic middle scenario, is a remarkable group of people, shaped by a century of extraordinary circumstances into something genuinely new, not quite the humans who boarded the ship 100 years ago, not yet the people they will become on the surface of an alien world, capable of completing the mission, committed in the ways that matter most to doing so, but carrying the weight of a century of accumulated human complexity, the unresolved conflicts, the institutional compromises, the biological changes, the cultural evolutions, into the next phase of the most extraordinary journey our species has ever undertaken, That is the realistic middle. Survival, arrival, success by the most important measures, but not without cost, not without change, and not without the specific kind of earned wisdom that only comes from having actually lived something this hard. Now the sobering lower bound. The scenario where things go wrong, not catastrophically, not in the dramatic way that ends a mission in a single moment, but in the slow, cumulative way that we identified before. And let's be specific about what going wrong actually means in this context, because it is not a single failure, it is a convergence. It starts with governance. Specifically, with the gradual concentration of decision-making power in a faction that prioritizes its own continuity over the mission's long-term health. This is not inevitable. Good institutional design actively prevents it. But good institutional design requires ongoing maintenance, just like every other system on the ship. And in the realistic lower bound, the governance maintenance slips, not all at once, but progressively, across generations, as the mechanisms for accountability and reform are quietly hollowed out by people who benefit from their absence. The consequences of governance failure ripple through every other system. Educational resource allocation shifts towards serving the interests of the governing faction rather than the functional needs of the mission. Technical knowledge begins to stratify, concentrated in a specialist class that is simultaneously indispensable and politically marginalized, which creates a dangerous dynamic where the people with the most critical knowledge have the least political power. Cultural management, the deliberate maintenance of mission-oriented meaning and purpose, becomes increasingly coercive as its authentic foundations erode, which triggers exactly the resistance and resentment that coercion always generates. In this scenario, the mission doesn't fail in a single dramatic moment. It degrades. The ship continues to function, the life support keeps running, the crops keep growing, the navigation computers keep tracking the destination. But the social fabric becomes increasingly strained, increasingly brittle, increasingly characterized by the specific kind of low-grade, chronic dysfunction that complex human systems develop when their governance has lost legitimacy and their culture has lost authenticity. By the third generation in this scenario, 2 or 3 distinct factions have emerged, each with a different vision of what the mission means and what the ship's society should look like. The factions coexist, uneasily, in the way that groups sharing a space they cannot leave always coexist, but the coexistence is fragile. The mechanisms for resolving factional conflict that the original governance system provided have been weakened or captured, and the alternatives that have emerged organically in their place are less robust and less legitimate. By the 4th generation, the arrival generation in this scenario, the ship reaches its destination with a population that is socially fragmented, technically capable but not at full depth, biologically stressed from a combination of radiation exposure and microbiome degradation, and the specific physiological consequences of sustained psychosocial stress across multiple generations, and culturally divided about what the mission means and who has the right to make decisions about what happens next. The mission is not over. The ship is in orbit. The destination is real and present and visible through every viewport. But the social consensus needed to make coherent decisions about how to proceed, about the protocols for surface approach, about who goes first and why, about how the ship's resources are allocated during the transition to surface settlement. That consensus is genuinely fragile. The arrival moment, which in the optimistic scenario is a collective exhale of shared purpose fulfilled, in this scenario is a flashpoint. The accumulated tensions of a century of social degradation, given the specific urgency and consequence of the arrival decisions, have the potential to crack in ways that are not easily repaired. Does the mission survive this scenario? Possibly. Human beings are resilient, and the shared reality of a destination after a century of crossing is a powerful social solvent capable of dissolving, at least temporarily, tensions that seemed irresolvable. The arrival generation, whatever its internal divisions, knows what the ship went through to get here. That knowledge is not nothing. It is potentially exactly the thing that pulls fractured social fabric back together at the moment it matters most. But it is not guaranteed, and the lower bound scenario where it is not guaranteed is real enough and well enough supported by what we know about human institutions and human psychology that it cannot be dismissed as improbable catastrophizing. It is the outcome that emerges when the social and cultural systems of the ship receive less than the same quality of intentional design and maintenance that the physical and engineering systems receive. So where does that leave us? With three scenarios: optimistic, realistic middle, and sobering lower bound, and a question about which one is most likely if humanity were to actually attempt a generation ship mission with the technology and knowledge available to us today or in the foreseeable future. The honest answer is that it depends almost entirely on choices we have not yet made. Not engineering choices, those are hard but tractable. The choices that matter most are social and cultural ones. Whether we invest as seriously in understanding and designing human systems as we invest in designing propulsion and life support. Whether we treat the psychological and sociological dimensions of a century-long mission with the same rigor and urgency that we treat the physical ones. Whether the governance structures and cultural frameworks we build are genuinely designed for resilience and adaptability, not just on paper but in practice, with real enforcement mechanisms and real accountability over generational timescales. These are choices that require a kind of institutional wisdom that our species has not yet reliably demonstrated at scale. We are good at building things. We are less reliably good at building the social systems that keep those things working across long timescales in ways that serve everyone rather than just the powerful. That is not a new observation. It is one of the oldest themes in political philosophy. But the generation ship makes it unusually specific and unusually urgent because the consequences of getting it wrong are sealed inside a hull in interstellar space with nowhere to go. Here is what the science gives us as a bottom line. A generation ship launched with a founding population of at minimum 10,000 individuals, equipped with the best life support and radiation shielding technology near-future engineering can provide, governed by institutions deliberately designed for multi-generational resilience, and supported by a culture intentionally engineered to transmit authentic purpose rather than hollow performance. Such a ship has a genuine probability of surviving a century-long crossing to Proxima Centauri. Not certainty, probability, a real one, not a theoretical one. The biological challenges are serious but not insurmountable. The psychological challenges are profound but not beyond human adaptive capacity. The social and governance challenges are the most dangerous and the least understood, but they are also the most within our control if we choose to take them as seriously as they deserve. The question of how long we would survive is not primarily a question about our bodies or our technology. It is a question about our institutions, our cultures, and our collective wisdom, about whether we are capable of building social systems that serve the long-term good of everyone inside them, rather than the short-term interests of whoever happens to be in power, about whether we can transmit genuine purpose, not the performance of it, but the real thing, across generations of people who never chose the mission but who were born into it and must decide, each of them, in their own lives, whether it is worth carrying forward. Those are not engineering questions, they are human ones. And the answers to them are not found in physics papers or genetics databases. They are found in what we know about ourselves, our history, our psychology, our demonstrated capacity for both extraordinary cooperation and extraordinary self-destruction, and in what we choose to do with that knowledge going forward. But the story is not finished yet, because we have traced the crossing and the arrival and the reckoning. But we have not yet talked about what the generation ship means in the largest possible frame, what it says about us as a species, what it requires of us as a civilization, and whether the extraordinary act of sending a piece of humanity to another star is worth everything it would cost. That question, the deepest one, the one underneath all the physics and the biology and the governance theory, is where we are going next. And it is the part of this conversation I have been most looking forward to, because the answer is not obvious, and not obvious in this context means exactly what it should, that it requires us to think carefully about what we value, what we are for, and what kind of species we want to be in the centuries to come. Stay with me. Why? It seems like the wrong question to ask at this point in the conversation. We have spent 6 parts building the case, the physics, the biology, the psychology, the governance, the arrival, the reckoning. We have established that it is possible, under the right conditions, with the right design, with the right human choices made consistently across a century. We have been honest about the ways it could fail and about what success would actually look like versus what it would feel like in the comfortable, cleaned-up version that the human imagination prefers. We have done the work. And now, after all of that, the question sitting underneath all of it, the one that was always there, that the engineering and the biology and the governance theory were always circling without quite landing on, is the simplest one, the one a child would ask. The one that turns out, when you sit with it long enough, to be the hardest one. Why would we do this? Not in the tactical sense, not why choose Proxima Centauri, or why now, or why this propulsion system rather than another. In the deepest sense, why would any human civilization, at any point in its history, make the decision to seal thousands of its members into a ship and send them into the dark between stars, knowing that none of the people who board the ship will live to complete the journey, knowing what it costs in resources, in human lives shaped by extraordinary constraint, in the specific suffering of middle generations who carry a purpose they didn't choose toward a destination they will never reach. Knowing all of that, with clear eyes and honest accounting. Why? The answer matters. Not just philosophically, not just as an intellectual exercise, but practically, concretely, for the mission itself. Because a generation ship launched without a genuine, deeply considered answer to the why question is a generation ship with a hollow foundation. And hollow foundations, as we established in Part 5, are exactly where the slow failures begin. Let's start with the answer that sounds most reasonable, and that, on examination, turns out to be more complicated than it appears. Survival. The generation ship as a backup. Humanity's hedge against the possibility that something catastrophic happens to Earth. An asteroid impact, a supervolcano, a runaway climate event, a pandemic of sufficient lethality, a nuclear exchange of sufficient scale. The list of extinction-level or civilization-ending threats that Earth-based humanity faces is not short, and the geological and biological record makes clear that mass extinction events are a real feature of this planet's history, not a theoretical concern. Sending a self-sustaining human population to another star system is, from this perspective, the ultimate insurance policy. The thing that ensures that the story of consciousness and curiosity and accumulated human knowledge does not end with the Earth. This is a compelling argument. It has genuine force. And it is one that serious thinkers, from the late Stephen Hawking, who argued repeatedly that the long-term survival of the species requires multiplanetary and ultimately multistellar habitation, to contemporary existential risk researchers who study the probability and consequences of civilization-ending events, take seriously as a foundational justification for interstellar ambition. But here is where it gets complicated. The generation ship, as a survival mechanism, only works if what survives is something recognizably continuous with what we are trying to preserve. If the civilization that arrives at Proxima Centauri after a century of crossing is so transformed, biologically, culturally, psychologically, socially, that it no longer meaningfully resembles the civilization that launched, then what exactly has been preserved? The genes, yes, the basic biological substrate of the human species in some form, but the specific things that make human civilization worth preserving, the accumulated art, the scientific tradition, the philosophical frameworks, the cultural diversity, the specific ways that human communities have found meaning and beauty and connection. Those are far more fragile than the genes and far more vulnerable to the specific pressures of a century-long sealed voyage. This doesn't invalidate the survival argument, but it complicates it. It means that a generation ship justified as a survival mechanism must take the preservation of human cultural and intellectual heritage not just in databases, but in living practice and genuine understanding, at least as seriously as it takes the preservation of human genetic material. The Ark must carry not just the people, but the things that make people worth being. The second answer is exploration. The generation ship as the ultimate expression of the human drive to go further, to see what is over the next horizon, to extend the range of direct human experience into territory that has never felt human eyes or human feet. This answer resonates deeply because it is not a rational calculation. It is a recognition of something that seems to be genuinely built into us: the curiosity, the restlessness, the specific dissatisfaction with boundaries that has driven human beings out of every comfortable situation they have ever settled into and toward every unknown landscape that presented itself. We left the forests for the savannas. We crossed the land bridges into new continents. We built boats and sailed beyond the visible horizon. We climbed mountains that served no practical purpose and crossed deserts that offered no material reward. We went to the moon, not because it was easy, as a certain speech famously noted, but because it was there, because the human organism confronted with a boundary has a deep and apparently ineradicable tendency to want to cross it. Proxima Centauri is the next horizon, the most distant, the most difficult, the most consequential, but not in the deepest sense, a different kind of thing from the horizons that have been calling to human beings since the species first developed the cognitive capacity to wonder what was on the other side. This is a beautiful argument, and it is in some ways the most honest one because it doesn't pretend to a rational justification that can be fully specified in advance. It says simply that this is what we are. That exploration is not something humans do for reasons external to themselves. It is something humans do because it is an expression of what they fundamentally are. And that a species that stops exploring, that decides the known world is sufficient, that the next horizon is not worth the cost of crossing, has, in some important sense, stopped being fully itself. The problem with this argument, as a justification for a generation ship specifically, is that it works beautifully for the founding generation, the people who actually feel the pull of the horizon, who make the choice, who board the ship with their eyes open and their hearts full of the specific, electric feeling of doing the impossible thing. It works less well as a justification for the people born on the ship who did not choose the horizon and cannot feel its pull in the same visceral way, and who are nonetheless required to live their entire lives in its service. Exploration as a justification is authentic for those who choose it. It is considerably harder to make authentic for those who inherit it. The third answer is the one that I find most interesting, most philosophically rich, and most genuinely honest about what the generation ship actually is and what it actually requires. The generation ship as an act of civilizational maturity. Here is what I mean by that. The history of human civilization, viewed at sufficient scale, is the history of our species gradually learning to extend its time horizon, to make decisions and investments whose benefits will be realized not by the people making them, but by people who have not yet been born. Agriculture at its most fundamental is this. You prepare a field and plant a seed not for today, but for a harvest that is months away. You build an institution, a university, a legal system, a scientific tradition, not for yourself, but for the generations that will use it after you are gone. You plant trees whose shade you will never sit in. You make sacrifices for children you will not live to see grow old. The capacity to do this, to genuinely invest in futures you will not personally experience, is one of the most distinctive and most important things about human civilization. It is what distinguishes us from organisms that can only respond to immediate circumstances. It is the cognitive and moral achievement that underlies every long-term institution, every intergenerational investment, every act of stewardship for a world that belongs to our descendants as much as to us. The generation ship is this capacity pushed to its absolute extreme. It is an investment in a future so distant that not one of the people making it will live to see its outcome. It is a commitment to descendants so many generations removed that the investors cannot even imagine their specific faces or names. It is the longest possible expression of the human capacity to care about something beyond the self and beyond the present moment. Understood this way, the generation ship is not just a technological achievement or an act of exploration. It is a moral achievement. It is proof, the most extreme possible proof, that our species is capable of acting on a timescale that matches the actual stakes of civilizational survival and growth, that we are not, in the end, trapped in the short-term thinking that has caused so much of our history's suffering, that we can hold 100-year commitment and mean it, not just in the founding generation's hearts, but in the institutions and cultures and social systems we build to carry it forward. Now, here is where this argument becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because the generation ship, as moral achievement, requires something of us that we are not currently demonstrating at scale. Look at the challenges we face on Earth right now. Climate change, a problem whose consequences unfold over decades and centuries, whose worst effects will be felt most severely by people not yet born, and whose mitigation requires sustained collective action across generations of political systems that are structurally biased towards short-term thinking. Biodiversity loss, the permanent erasure of millions of species and the ecological systems they constitute, happening at a rate driven by decisions whose long-term consequences are understood and whose short-term economic incentives are simply, in the current structure of our civilization, stronger than the long-term ones. Nuclear arsenals, the specific existential threat of weapons capable of ending human civilization, sitting in the hands of political systems whose time horizons extend, in practice, to the next election cycle. These are generation ship-scale problems. They require exactly the kind of long-term, multi-generational, collective commitment that a generation ship mission would require, and we are not, as a species, currently meeting them with anything like the rigor and consistency that they demand. What does it mean to seriously propose a generation ship? To commit resources and intelligence and human lives to a century-long mission to another star, when the civilization proposing it is simultaneously failing to sustain the multi-generational commitments required to manage its own planetary home? Is this hypocrisy, a distraction, the specific seductive fantasy of escaping to a new world because the old one is getting difficult? These are not comfortable questions, but they are honest ones. And the honest answer is that the generation ship and the long-term management of Earth's civilization and ecology are not in competition. They are expressions of the same underlying capacity. If we can build the institutional wisdom and cultural depth to sustain a century-long mission to another star, that same wisdom and depth is exactly what we need to sustain multi-generational commitments on Earth. And if we cannot build it, if we have not learned to think and act on generational timescales in our own backyard, then we are not ready for a generation ship regardless of whether we can engineer one. The generation ship in this framing is not an escape from the challenges of Earth. It is a test of whether we have become the kind of civilization that can face them. There is one more dimension of the why question that we haven't addressed yet, and it is, in some ways, the most intimate one, the one that lives not in civilizational strategy or philosophical principle, but in the specific human experience of the people on the ship. Why would any individual person choose this? Not the civilization, the person, the specific human being who boards the ship knowing they will spend the rest of their life on it and die somewhere in the dark between stars without ever seeing the destination. What does a life lived entirely in service of a mission you will not personally complete feel like from the inside? And is that a life that can be genuinely good, not just meaningful in the abstract, but actually, viscerally, daily good? The people who have thought most carefully about this question, the philosophers and psychologists and anthropologists who study human meaning-making under extreme conditions, tend to converge on an answer that is, once you hear it, somewhat obvious. But obvious in the way that deep truths often are, simple on the surface, with enormous complexity underneath. A life is not made good by the achievement of its goals. It is made good by the quality of its living, by the depth of its relationships, the richness of its experience, the degree to which it is genuinely engaged with something larger than itself. The founding generation's volunteers, if they are psychologically healthy and well prepared and supported by a culture that is genuinely conducive to human flourishing, will not spend their lives grieving the destination they will not reach. They will spend their lives doing something extraordinary, something that no human being has ever done, in an environment that is genuinely novel, with companions who share one of the most remarkable undertakings in human history. Their lives, measured by the things that actually make lives feel worth living, have the potential to be extraordinarily rich. And the middle generations, the ones born on the ship who did not choose and will not arrive, their lives are not diminished in their value by the fact that they serve a purpose larger than any individual life. Every human being who has ever lived has been part of a story larger than themselves, a historical moment, a civilizational project, a natural world that preceded them and will continue after they are gone. Being part of the story of the first interstellar crossing is, from one perspective, as extraordinary a context for a human life as has ever existed. Whether it feels that way from the inside, whether the middle generations find it a gift or a burden, depends on everything we have discussed in the previous parts. On the culture, the governance, the psychology, the daily quality of life on the ship, on whether the social system around them treats them as full human beings with their own intrinsic worth, or as instruments of a mission that regards their individual lives as means to an end. That distinction between a civilization that treats its members as ends in themselves and one that treats them as means is the oldest and most important distinction in political philosophy. And on a generation ship, it is not abstract. It is the difference between a mission that succeeds by any measure worth caring about and one that succeeds technically while failing the people inside it. Here is what all of this adds up to. The why of a generation ship is not a single answer. It is a convergence of answers, survival, exploration, civilizational maturity, individual meaning that reinforce each other when the mission is designed and executed well, and that pull apart when it is not. The why is not given in advance. It is built deliberately across every decision made by every generation that carries the mission forward. It is renewed or allowed to erode in every conversation and every cultural practice and every governance choice that shapes the lived experience of the people on the ship. The question of why is not one that the founding generation can answer once and transmit as a finished product. It is a question that every generation must answer for itself, in its own language, in its own cultural idiom, in relation to its own specific experience of what the ship is and what the mission means and what it costs. The sustainability of the mission depends not on whether the why is answered correctly at the beginning, but on whether the culture and the institutions of the ship are designed to support the ongoing answering of it, generation after generation, in ways that are genuine rather than performed. That is the deepest design challenge, and it is also, in some sense, the deepest expression of what makes us human, the fact that meaning is not a fixed thing, not a resource you can stockpile at launch and draw down across a century. It is alive, it grows and changes, and must be continuously renewed by the people who carry it. It is, in the most fundamental sense, what we are. We are almost at the end of this journey. One more part to go, the part where we pull everything together and deliver the final answer. The honest, complete, scientifically grounded verdict on how long a generation ship society could survive. And beyond the verdict, the thing that this whole conversation has really been building toward, the thing that the generation ship reveals about us, not just as a species with a particular set of biological and social characteristics, but as the specific kind of consciousness that looks up at the stars and asks what is up there and whether we could go. That moment is next, and it is worth staying for. Let's bring it home, not with a neat, comfortable conclusion that wraps everything up in a way that feels satisfying but isn't quite honest. Not with the kind of ending that science communication sometimes reaches for when the material is difficult, the reassuring pivot to optimism, the inspirational final note that papers over the genuine uncertainty with a coat of motivational warmth. That is not what this conversation deserves, and it is not what you came here for. What you came here for is the real answer. The one that takes everything we have covered, the physics, the biology, the psychology, the governance, the cultural design, the philosophical reckoning, and synthesizes it into something that is actually useful, something that tells you not just what the science says, but what it means. For the mission, for the species, for the specific moment in history that we are living through right now, which turns out to be far more relevant to the generation ship question than it might initially appear. So here is the verdict. As honest and as complete as the current state of human knowledge allows, a generation ship mission to Proxima Centauri or to any stellar destination within a similar range is survivable, not guaranteed, not easy, not without costs that are real and serious, and borne disproportionately by people who never chose to bear them, but survivable in the genuine, technical, scientifically supportable sense of the word. The biological challenges, while significant, fall within the range of what deliberate engineering and medical design can address. The psychological challenges, while profound, fall within the range of what deliberate cultural and social design can address. The governance challenges are the hardest and the least understood, but they are also the most within our control, which means they are the ones where the quality of our choices matters most. The minimum conditions for survival, based on everything the research currently supports, look something like this. A founding population of no fewer than 10,000 genetically diverse individuals, ideally drawn from the broadest possible range of human genetic backgrounds, a rotating habitat producing gravity within roughly 10% of Earth normal, maintained with sufficient redundancy that no single failure can cause it to stop. A closed-loop life support system operating at efficiency levels that current technology has not yet achieved, but that the trajectory of current research suggests are achievable within the next several decades. A radiation shielding system that cannot eliminate the cosmic ray dose, but can reduce it to levels that, combined with advances in radiation medicine and DNA repair therapy, keep the cumulative health impact within a survivable range across a century. A frozen genetic repository, sperm, eggs, and potentially embryos, large enough and diverse enough to serve as a biological buffer against whatever genetic drift and bottlenecking the living population experiences during the crossing. Those are the physical minimums. They are hard. They require engineering advances that do not yet exist in deployable form, but they are directionally achievable. The research is moving toward them, even if slowly and without the specific urgency that a committed interstellar program would bring. The social and cultural minimums are harder to specify precisely because they are not engineering tolerances. They are human qualities, but the research points towards several non-negotiables. A governance system with genuine, structurally enforced mechanisms for accountability and reform, not just on paper but in practice, with real consequences for the concentration of power and real pathways for legitimate challenge and change. An educational framework that treats the maintenance of living technical knowledge as a mission-critical priority, equivalent to the maintenance of the life support hardware itself. A cultural system that keeps the mission authentic, that gives every generation of people on the ship genuine, personally felt reasons to care about the destination, rather than merely performing the mission as an inherited ritual emptied of its original conviction, and a psychological support infrastructure that takes seriously the specific cumulative mental health challenges of multi-generational confinement, not as a secondary concern but as a primary one, funded and staffed, and given the same institutional priority as the agricultural systems and the engineering departments. These are not soft requirements. They are as load-bearing as the hull. A generation ship that meets all the physical minimums but fails the social and cultural ones will not survive the crossing in any sense worth caring about. It will arrive, if it arrives, carrying people whose relationship to the mission and to each other has been so damaged by a century of institutional failure and cultural erosion that the work of building a civilization on an alien world is almost certainly beyond their current capacity. The hardware will be intact, the mission will be, in the most meaningful sense, lost. So how long specifically? Under the optimistic conditions, everything roughly right, directionally well-designed, managed with sustained competence and genuine commitment across the generations, a generation ship heading to Proxima Centauri at the best speed near-future propulsion can achieve would take somewhere between 80 and 140 years to complete the crossing, 3 to 5 human generations, long enough to be genuinely transformative of the population inside. Not so long that the cumulative biological and social pressures exceed what good design can manage. Under realistic middle conditions, the scenario where things go mostly right, but with the specific imperfections that real human systems always produce, the crossing is survivable but costly. The arrival population is smaller, genetically less diverse, technically shallower, and socially more complex than the founding population. It carries the weight of a century of accumulated human difficulty in ways that will shape the surface settlement phase significantly. Success is achievable, but it requires an arrival generation with both the competence and the collective will to work through the inherited complications rather than being paralyzed by them. Under the sobering lower bound, where the social and cultural systems receive insufficient desired attention and degrade progressively across generations, the crossing may be completed in the physical sense without being completed in the mission sense. A ship may arrive. Whether what arrives constitutes a functioning civilization capable of establishing a meaningful human presence on another world is a genuine open question in this scenario. The range between these outcomes is not determined by physics or by biology. It is determined by choices, by the quality of the institutional and cultural design work done before launch and maintained across the crossing, by whether the people making those design choices take the human dimensions of the mission as seriously as the engineering ones, by whether the civilization that sends the ship is, at the moment it sends it, genuinely serious about the full complexity of what it is attempting. Now let's zoom out, because the generation ship does not exist in isolation. It is a product of a specific civilization at a specific moment in its development, and the question of whether that civilization is ready to attempt a generation ship, not just technologically, but in every sense that actually matters, is inseparable from a broader question about where we are in our own story. We are, by most measures, in the early adolescence of our civilization's engagement with space. We have reached our moon. We have sent robotic emissaries to every planet in our solar system and beyond. We have placed telescopes in orbit that can detect the atmospheric signatures of planets orbiting other stars. Planets that, a century ago, we did not even know existed. We are right now in the early stages of returning humans to the lunar surface and developing the technologies and operational experience that a Mars mission would require. The trajectory is real, the progress is genuine, but we are also a civilization that has not yet solved the problems of its own planetary home, that has not yet demonstrated, at the civilizational scale, the capacity for the kind of multi-generational commitment and collective action that the most serious challenges of the 21st century require. That is still, in many of its most consequential institutions, governed by incentive structures that systematically prioritize the short-term over the long, the local over the global, the interests of the currently living over those of the not yet born. This is not a counsel of despair, it is an honest assessment of where we are, and where we are is not at the end of that developmental arc, it is in the middle of it. The capacity for long-term, multi-generational, civilizational scale commitment exists in us. It has existed in every era of human history, expressed imperfectly and inconsistently, but genuinely. The question is whether we are growing into it, whether the arc of our civilization's development is bending, however slowly and unevenly, toward the kind of institutional maturity that a generation ship requires. The evidence is genuinely mixed. There are reasons for optimism, the extraordinary achievements of international scientific collaboration, the rapid development of renewable energy driven by a combination of policy commitment and technological innovation, the growing body of research on long-term thinking in institutions and governance, the specific, remarkable fact that we are having this conversation at all, that a species which 60 years ago had not yet left its own atmosphere is now seriously, scientifically, rigorously discussing the design requirements for a multi-generational mission to another star. That is not nothing. That is, in the context of the 4-billion-year history of life on this planet, extraordinary, and there are reasons for sobriety. The specific challenges of our current moment, the political fragmentation, the erosion of trust in institutions, the difficulty of sustaining collective commitment across electoral cycles, let alone across generations, are real. They are not insurmountable, but they are real. And a generation ship launched by a civilization that has not worked seriously on these challenges is a generation ship whose social and cultural systems will reflect the specific weaknesses of the civilization that built them. Here is the thing that I keep coming back to when I think about the generation ship question. The thing that feels, to me, like the most important insight that this whole conversation produces. The generation ship is not just a destination, it is a mirror. Every question it raises about how to sustain human purpose across generations, how to design institutions that serve the long-term good rather than short-term interests, how to transmit genuine meaning rather than hollow performance across the span of a century, how to treat people born into circumstances they did not choose as full human beings with intrinsic worth rather than instruments of a larger purpose. Every one of those questions is a question we are already facing, right here, right now, on Earth, in the specific civilizational moment we are living through. The challenge of keeping a generation ship's mission authentic across a century is the same challenge as keeping a democracy's founding values alive across generations. The challenge of maintaining the living technical knowledge needed to keep a ship's life support running is the same challenge as maintaining the scientific and institutional knowledge needed to manage a planet's climate and biodiversity. The challenge of governing a sealed, finite community of people who cannot leave is the same challenge, scaled and intensified, but not categorically different, as governing any community where people's fates are intertwined and exit is costly. The generation ship forces us to confront these challenges in their purest, most extreme, most unavoidable form, and in doing so, it gives us something invaluable, a thought experiment that makes visible the things about our own civilization that we need to understand and improve, not for the sake of an interstellar mission that may or may not happen in this century, but for the sake of the world we are actually living in right now. If we take the generation ship seriously, not just as a science fiction concept or a distant technological aspiration, but as a real design problem that requires real answers, we are forced to take seriously the questions about human institutions and human cultures and human psychology that are most urgently relevant to our present situation. We are forced to ask what it takes to sustain genuine collective commitment across generations, what makes institutions trustworthy over long timescales, how cultures transmit authentic purpose rather than hollow performance, what human beings need in order to flourish under conditions of constraint and uncertainty. These are not generation ship questions, they are civilization questions. The generation ship just makes them impossible to avoid. Let's talk about what comes next. Not in the abstract future of interstellar travel, but in the specific near-term, practically achievable future of the research and development that a serious generation ship program would require. The most important work is not the propulsion research, though that matters enormously. It is not the life support engineering, though that too is critical. The most important work, the work that is most underfunded, most undervalued, and most consequential for whether a generation ship mission succeeds or fails, is the work of understanding human systems at the timescales and conditions that a generation ship would impose. Long-duration isolation studies, not the 6-month Antarctic winter overs or the year-long simulated Mars missions that currently exist, though those are valuable, but studies designed around the specific multi-generational dynamics that a generation ship would produce. Research into the epigenetics of closed environments and how they evolve across generations. Research into the cultural transmission of purpose and the specific conditions under which it succeeds or fails. Research into governance systems for closed, long-duration communities and what makes them resilient against the failure modes we identified in Part 5. Research into the microbiome dynamics of closed-loop agricultural systems and their long-term health implications for the human populations that depend on them. This research is achievable. It requires sustained funding and institutional commitment. exactly the kind of long-term investment that our current civilization finds structurally difficult but not impossible, and its benefits are not confined to the generation ship. Every insight generated by this research is directly applicable to the challenges of designing better institutions, better cultures, better social systems, right here, right now, on Earth. The Generation Ship program, pursued seriously, is a civilization improvement program. The best possible reason to do it is not the destination. It is what the attempt makes of us. There is a photograph. You may have seen it. Most people have, even if they don't remember where or when. It was taken on the 14th of February 1990 by a spacecraft called Voyager 1 from a distance of roughly 6 billion kilometers from Earth. At the request of Carl Sagan, the camera was turned back toward the inner solar system one last time before it crossed beyond the range where such a photograph was possible, and there, in a beam of scattered sunlight, suspended in the absolute black of interstellar space, was a pale blue dot. That is us. That single pixel, barely distinguishable from the noise in the image, containing every human being who ever lived, every war ever fought, every civilization ever built and destroyed, every act of love and cruelty and genius and foolishness that the human story has produced across its entire history, every mountain climbed, every ocean crossed, every question asked and asked again, all of it in that one pale, fragile, luminous point. Sagan wrote about that photograph in a way that has never been improved upon. He said, "Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near term, to which our species could migrate. Visit, yes. Settle, not yet. Like it or not, for the moment the Earth is where we make our stand." He wrote that in 1994. 30 years on, every word of it remains true, and it is, I want to suggest, the most important context in which to understand everything this video has explored. The generation ship conversation is ultimately not about the generation ship. It is about the pale blue dot, about what it means to be a species that is aware of its own fragility, aware of the vast indifferent darkness surrounding it, aware that the world it inhabits is finite and vulnerable and irreplaceable, and that must decide, in full possession of that awareness, what kind of civilization to build and what kind of future to reach toward. The generation ship represents one possible answer to that challenge, not the only answer, not necessarily the most urgent one, given where we are right now, but a real answer, a genuine, scientifically grounded, philosophically serious response to the question of what a species does when it understands that its long-term survival requires expanding beyond the single world it was born on. And what we have discovered over the course of this conversation is that the answer to whether we can survive a generation ship crossing is not primarily a technical answer. It is a human one. The technology is hard but achievable. The biology is challenging but manageable. The thing that will determine whether a generation ship mission succeeds or fails, whether it produces a flourishing human community at the destination or a traumatized, fractured remnant of one, is the quality of our human systems, our institutions, our cultures, our capacity for genuine, sustained, multi-generational commitment to something larger than any individual life. We have that capacity. It is in us. The evidence is everywhere if you know how to look for it. In every institution that has survived centuries by genuinely serving its stated purpose. In every act of scientific collaboration that has produced knowledge no single person or nation could have produced alone. In every community that has faced extraordinary adversity and found, in that adversity, the specific kind of solidarity that makes human beings at their best genuinely extraordinary. But the capacity is not automatic. It does not activate without effort. It requires exactly the kind of deliberate, thoughtful, sustained design work that the generation ship demands, applied not just to the ship but to the civilization that sends it, to the institutions we build and the cultures we create and the choices we make every day about what kind of future we are investing in and who gets to share in it. Let me tell you something about the people who would actually be on a generation ship, not the engineers and the mission planners and the governance designers, the people, the ordinary human beings who would be born into that extraordinary situation and would have to find a way to make a life inside it. They would wake up in the morning, ship's morning, defined by artificial light cycling through a rhythm calibrated to keep their circadian systems healthy, and they would do the things that human beings have always done in the morning: make something to eat, talk to someone they love, think about what the day holds, feel in the specific wordless way that feelings arrive before thoughts, whatever combination of purpose and anxiety and hope and routine that constitutes their particular relationship to their particular life on a particular day somewhere between the stars. They would argue about small things and care deeply about large ones. They would fall in love and fall out of love and raise children who would ask questions they couldn't always answer. They would do work that mattered and work that felt pointless and work that turned out, years later, to have been more important than they knew at the time. They would grieve people they lost and celebrate things that deserved celebrating and spend quiet evenings looking at the star field through the observation windows, knowing that one of those points of light, faint, unremarkable to the untrained eye, is where they came from, and another is where they are going. Their lives would be, in the most fundamental sense, human lives, shaped by extraordinary circumstances but not defined by them. The extraordinary circumstances would be the context, the humanity would be the content, and the humanity, the specific, irreducible, stubbornly persistent fact of what it means to be a conscious being who loves and grieves and wonders and hopes, would be the thing that matters most, the thing the mission is ultimately for. Because if the mission is not for the people inside the ship, if it treats them as means rather than ends, as instruments of a larger purpose rather than as the purpose itself, then it has already failed in the way that matters most, regardless of what the arrival data shows. A generation ship that produces human suffering in the service of human survival has confused the measure for the thing being measured. Survival is not the point. Flourishing is the point, and flourishing requires that every person on the ship, in every generation of the crossing, is treated as a full human being whose life has intrinsic worth, not contingent on what they contribute to the mission, not conditional on their productivity or their conformity or their usefulness to the people in power, but simply and unconditionally by virtue of being the kind of thing they are. That is not a soft requirement. It is the hardest one, and it is the one that no amount of engineering excellence can substitute for. There is a concept in long-duration spaceflight research called the overview effect. It was first described systematically by the writer Frank White in 1987, based on interviews with astronauts who had seen Earth from space. What they described consistently across different missions, different nationalities, different personal and cultural backgrounds was a cognitive and emotional shift that happened when they looked down at the planet from orbit. A sudden, visceral understanding of Earth's fragility, a dissolution of the boundaries between nations and peoples that from the surface feel permanent and significant, and that from orbit look arbitrary and small, a feeling of connection to the planet, to all the life on it, to the entire human story that many of them described as the most profound experience of their lives. The overview effect is real. It has been documented carefully enough that it is now taken seriously as a genuine psychological phenomenon, not just a poetic description, and it raises a fascinating and important question for the generation ship. What is the equivalent experience for people who have left the overview behind entirely, who are not in orbit around Earth but in the deep between stars, where Earth itself is no longer visible as a planet, just another point of light distinguished from the others only by knowledge and memory and cultural transmission? The answer, I think, is something that does not yet have a name, something that the generation ship would produce in its middle generations, the ones born in the crossing who will never see Earth as anything but a story and will not live to see the destination as anything but a promise, something that might be the most profound cognitive and emotional experience in human history if it is given the right conditions to develop fully rather than being suppressed by cultural anxiety or institutional rigidity. Those middle generations will be the first human beings to live entirely in the in-between, not from anywhere, not going anywhere in their own lifetimes, suspended in the dark between two stars, carrying the weight of a century-long human project in their hands and in their cells, and in the stories they tell their children. They will have a relationship to the cosmos that no human being before them has ever had, a relationship that is not mediated by a planetary surface or a gravitational anchor or the specific grounding comfort of a world that holds you, a relationship that is raw and direct and unprecedented in its intimacy with the actual scale of things, what that does to a human consciousness, what it produces in terms of understanding and experience, and the specific kind of wisdom that only comes from living something no one has ever lived before, is genuinely unknown. We can speculate, we can draw on the overview effect and the testimony of long-duration astronauts and the research on isolation and confinement and the philosophy of place and belonging, but we cannot know, because it has never happened, and that unknowing is itself significant, because it means that the generation ship, for all its risks and costs and profound challenges, is also a frontier in the deepest sense, a genuinely new kind of human experience, a place where the maps run out and what lies beyond them is not just physically but psychologically and philosophically uncharted, where human beings will discover things about themselves and their relationship to the universe that cannot be known in any other way. That frontier has always called to us. In every era and every culture and every generation of our species' history, the call of the genuinely unknown has been one of the most powerful forces in human experience. The generation ship is not the end of that call. It is its fullest expression, the furthest reach of the human impulse to go and see and know, applied to the largest available scale. Here is where the science and the philosophy and the human story converge. Here is the thing that all of this has been building toward. We are, right now, at a specific and consequential moment in the story of our species, a moment when the questions that the generation ship forces us to ask about long-term commitment, about institutional design, about the transmission of purpose across generations, about what it means to treat human beings as ends rather than means, are not just relevant to a hypothetical future mission. They are urgently relevant to the actual challenges of the world we are living in today. We are a species that has, for the first time in its history, the technological capability to destroy itself, and, for the first time in its history, the scientific understanding to recognize that the universe is inconceivably larger and older than we are, that the pale blue dot is genuinely singular and genuinely fragile, and that what happens to it, what happens to us, matters in a way that the cosmos does not guarantee will be preserved or protected from outside. We are also a species that has, for the first time in its history, the beginnings of the knowledge needed to become something larger, to extend the range of human experience and human presence beyond the single world we were born on, to become, in the fullest sense, a multi-planetary and eventually a multi-stellar species, not because the cosmos requires it of us, but because we choose it, because we look at the pale blue dot and the vast dark surrounding it and decide, freely and deliberately, that the story is worth continuing and worth expanding and worth the extraordinary cost that expansion demands. The generation ship is the most extreme expression of that choice. It is the point at which the decision to reach further becomes irreversible in the most human sense, not just a plan or an ambition or a program, but a community of people, living and breathing and growing up and growing old, committed to the journey in the most complete way possible. It is the moment when the choice becomes real. And what the science tells us, what everything we have explored in this conversation ultimately adds up to, is that the choice is possible, not guaranteed, not free of cost, not without the risk of failure in ways that are genuinely serious and genuinely painful, but possible in the hands of a civilization that takes the challenge seriously enough to meet it with the full depth of its intelligence and its wisdom and its capacity for the kind of long-term commitment that the most important things have always required. The question is not whether we can build the ship. We can. The question is whether we can build the civilization that the ship requires, the one with the institutional wisdom and the cultural depth and the genuine commitment to human flourishing that makes the difference between a mission that succeeds and one that fails. That is the question this video has been asking all along. Not just about a generation ship, about us, about what we are becoming, about whether the arc of our civilization's development is bending toward the kind of species that can hold a century-long commitment and mean it, not just at launch, but across every generation of the crossing, in the hearts and the choices of every human being who carries the mission forward. I think it is. I think we are. Not because the evidence is unambiguous, it is not, but because the capacity is genuinely there, and because the moment we are living through, for all its difficulty and complexity and genuine danger, is also a moment of extraordinary scientific understanding and technological capability, and, in the most important places, genuine moral seriousness about the challenges ahead. We are made of stardust. Every atom in your body was forged in the heart of a star that died before our sun was born. We are the universe looking at itself, asking questions about itself, reaching toward itself across the incomprehensible dark. That is not a metaphor, that is the literal truth of what we are. And the generation ship is what that truth looks like when it takes its fullest possible form. When the universe's capacity for curiosity and wonder and commitment expressed through us decides to cross the dark between stars and see what is on the other side, whether we are ready is the only question that remains. And the answer to that question is being written right now, in the choices we make, and the institutions we build, and the kind of civilization we decide, together, to become. The stars are waiting. They have been waiting for 4.5 billion years. They can wait a little longer while we get this right. You are still here. Think about what that means for a moment. You started this video, however long ago that was, wherever you were sitting or standing or lying when you pressed play, and you are still here, still listening, still turning these ideas over in whatever particular corner of your mind is reserved for the things that genuinely matter to you, the things that reach past the surface and touch something deeper, something that was already there, waiting to be touched. That is not a small thing. In a world designed to fragment attention, in a media landscape engineered to pull your focus in 100 directions simultaneously, choosing to stay with one idea, to follow it all the way down through 10 parts and 100,000 characters, and every difficult, honest, uncomfortable question we have asked along the way. That is an act of genuine intellectual commitment. It says something about you, something good, and it means that what follows is not a formality, not the standard closing remarks that signal to the algorithm that the video has ended. It is the last piece of something we have been building together across this entire conversation, the piece that is meant to stay with you. Let's go back to the beginning, not to the first words of this video, though we will get there, but to the beginning of the question itself. The moment when the idea of a generation ship first occurs to a thinking mind, it happens something like this. You are looking at the night sky, or reading about it, or watching something like this, and you encounter the number 4.24 light-years, the distance to Proxima Centauri, our nearest stellar neighbor, and for a moment the number sits there, seemingly manageable. 4.24, a small number. As numbers go, you could write it on a napkin, you could say it in a single breath, and then the understanding arrives. 4.24 light-years means that light, the fastest thing in the known universe, the thing that crosses a room before you can blink, that travels from the moon to your eyes in just over a second, that covers the distance from the sun to Earth in 8 minutes. Light, traveling at its full, unimaginable speed, takes 4 years and nearly 3 months to cover the gap between our sun and the next one, and we cannot travel at the speed of light, not even close. The fastest spacecraft we have ever built, the Parker Solar Probe, which recently became the fastest human-made object in history at roughly 690,000 kilometers per hour, would take about 6,900 years to reach Proxima Centauri. 6,900 years, the entirety of recorded human history, 7 times over. That is when the generation ship idea emerges, naturally and almost inevitably, from the confrontation between human ambition and physical reality. If we cannot go fast enough to make the crossing in a single lifetime, if even our most optimistic propulsion concepts would still require decades, if not centuries, then the only way to get there is to build a world that travels, to send not just a crew but a civilization, to launch something that carries not just the people who board it, but the people who will be born on it, and the people born to those people across the dark between stars. It is one of the most audacious ideas our species has ever seriously entertained, and it is, as we have now established in exhaustive and honest detail, genuinely possible, under the right conditions, with the right design, with the right human choices sustained across the right timescales. Possible, let's be precise about what we know and what we don't, because precision, at the end of a conversation this long and this serious, is a form of respect for the science, for the question, and for you. We know the biology well enough to specify the minimum population requirements for genetic viability across a multi-generational crossing. The number is approximately 10,000 individuals drawn from maximally diverse genetic backgrounds, supplemented by frozen genetic material to buffer against bottlenecking. We know this because population genetics is a mature field with solid empirical foundations, and the calculations have been done carefully by people whose professional lives are dedicated to getting them right. We know the physics of radiation in deep space well enough to understand the nature and scale of the challenge, the galactic cosmic rays that no feasible shielding can eliminate entirely, the solar energetic particle events that can be managed with sufficient warning systems and shielding mass, the cumulative dose that a population would receive across a century-long crossing. We know that this dose is serious. We know that it is not instantly lethal. We know that its long-term health consequences, combined with the best radiation medicine that the next several decades of research will produce, fall within the range of manageable, costly, but survivable. We know enough about closed-loop life support to understand what efficiency levels are required for a self-sustaining agricultural system capable of feeding 10,000 people indefinitely, and we know that current technology is not yet there, but that the trajectory of current research is moving in the right direction. We know that artificial gravity, through rotation, is physically achievable and that its health benefits for bone density, cardiovascular function, fluid distribution, and the dozens of other physiological systems that depend on gravity are well established enough to make it a non-negotiable design requirement rather than a nice-to-have. We know, from the growing body of research on long-duration isolation and confinement, enough about the psychological and social dynamics of closed human communities to understand the specific failure modes they are vulnerable to. We know that these failure modes are not inevitable. They are the predictable consequences of specific design choices and specific cultural conditions, which means they are preventable by different design choices and different cultural conditions. We know that the social and governance systems of a generation ship are as load-bearing as its hull, and that they require the same quality of deliberate engineering attention, applied not just at launch but continuously across the entire crossing. And we know, this is perhaps the most important thing we know, that the difference between a generation ship mission that succeeds and one that fails is not primarily determined by the hardware. It is determined by the people, by the quality of the institutions they build and the cultures they create and the choices they make every generation about what kind of community they want to be and what kind of future they are reaching toward. That knowledge, the knowledge of what it actually takes for a human community to sustain genuine commitment and genuine flourishing across generational timescales, is the knowledge we most need right now. Not just for the generation ship, for everything. Here is the number you came for, the one this whole video has been building toward. The answer, as honest and complete as the current state of human knowledge allows, to the question in the title, how long would we survive on a generation ship? Under the best achievable conditions, the right population size, the right engineering, the right institutional design, the right cultural framework, the right sustained commitment across generations. The answer is long enough to make the crossing, long enough to arrive, long enough to begin the work of building a human presence on another world, carrying with us not just our genes and our technology, but our languages and our music and our stories and our grief and our love and our irrepressible, ancient, utterly characteristic need to know what is on the other side of the next horizon. Long enough is not a number, it is a verdict. And the verdict is conditional, dependent on choices that have not yet been made by a civilization that has not yet fully become what it needs to be to make them well. But it is genuine, the survival is achievable, the mission is possible, and the question of whether we attempt it, and when, and with what level of seriousness and wisdom and genuine commitment to the people who would live and die inside the crossing. That question is ours to answer, not some future generation's question. Ours. Because the choices that determine whether a generation ship mission succeeds or fails are not made at launch. They are made in the decades before launch, in the research programs and institutional designs and cultural conversations that either build the foundations of success or leave them hollow. And those conversations are happening right now, in research papers and conference rooms and late-night discussions between scientists and philosophers and engineers who are taking this seriously enough to do the hard, unglamorous, absolutely essential work of figuring out not just whether it is technically possible, but what it would actually require of us as human beings. You are part of that conversation now. By watching this, by following the argument all the way through, by engaging with the full complexity of what a generation ship actually demands, you have joined something, a slowly growing community of people who understand that the most important questions about interstellar travel are not engineering questions, they are human ones. and that the answers to those human questions will determine not just the fate of a hypothetical mission to another star, but the trajectory of our civilization here on the pale blue dot. In the years and decades immediately ahead, there is something I want to say directly to you, not to a general audience, to you specifically, the person who is still here at the end of this. The universe is incomprehensibly large and incomprehensibly old. It has been around for 13.8 billion years, and the best current evidence suggests it will continue for timescales so enormous that the numbers involved stop meaning anything to the human brain. Stars will form and die across timescales that make the current age of the universe look like a morning. Galaxies will collide and merge and drift apart across distances that make the gap between us and Proxima Centauri look like a step. And in the middle of all of this, on a pale blue dot orbiting an unremarkable star in the outer arm of a spiral galaxy among hundreds of billions of galaxies, there is something that looks up and wonders. Something that asks questions about what it is and where it came from, and whether it is alone and what is out there beyond the next horizon. Something that, confronted with the scale and the age and the indifference of the universe, does not retreat into silence or despair but reaches forward, with curiosity and courage and the specific, beautiful, slightly irrational conviction that understanding matters and that the reaching itself is worth something regardless of what it finds. That something is us. It is you. It is every human being who has ever looked up at the night sky and felt simultaneously tiny and significant. Tiny because the scale is real and the darkness is real, and the fragility of everything we are and everything we have built is real, and significant because the awareness itself is extraordinary. Because the fact that the universe has produced something capable of comprehending its own scale and history and structure is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most remarkable things that has ever happened in it. You are made of stardust. Not poetically, literally. The calcium in your bones was forged in the nuclear furnace of a dying star. The iron in your blood was scattered across space in a supernova explosion billions of years before the sun was born. The oxygen in your lungs, the carbon in your cells, the nitrogen in your DNA, all of it assembled in stellar interiors across cosmic timescales and delivered to this planet by the processes that make worlds. You are, in the most literal and verifiable sense, the universe having an experience of itself, and the generation ship, that audacious, difficult, extraordinary, deeply human idea, is what happens when the universe's capacity for curiosity and wonder and long-term commitment expressed through us decides to reach across the dark and touch another star. Whether we are ready to do it is the question this video has asked. Whether we will become ready is the question that our civilization is answering right now, in real time, through every choice we make about the kind of future we are building. The answer is not yet final. It is being written, and you, the person still here at the end, are one of the people writing it. That is not a small thing. That is, in its own quiet way, everything. Look up tonight if the sky is clear where you are. Find the southern sky if you can, and look for a faint reddish point of light low on the horizon, barely visible, easy to miss, unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know what they're looking at. That is Proxima Centauri's general direction, the closest star to our Sun, the most realistic destination our species could ever point a generation ship toward, 4.24 light-years away, 25 trillion miles of absolute dark between here and there, and somewhere in that direction, around a small, dim, quietly burning red dwarf star, there is a planet. Proxima Centauri b, rocky, roughly Earth-sized, sitting in the zone where liquid water could exist. We do not know if it has an atmosphere. We do not know if it has the magnetic field that would protect a surface from the star's frequent flares. We do not know if it is a world that any living thing could call home, but we know it is there. and knowing it is there. Being the kind of species that can look at a faint point of light in the night sky and know, from the mathematics of orbital mechanics and the spectroscopy of starlight, that there is a world in orbit around it, that knowledge is already extraordinary, it is already a form of reaching, a form of arrival before the ship is ever built, or the crew ever chosen, or the first child is ever born on a voyage that will outlast every person who begins it. The universe is not waiting for us. It does not need us. It was here before we arrived, and it will continue long after we are gone, in forms we cannot imagine and on timescales we cannot comprehend. But we are here right now, in this specific and unrepeatable moment, capable of understanding something of what the universe is and reaching, however slowly and imperfectly, toward a larger experience of it. That reaching is what makes us what we are. It is the thing worth preserving, worth extending, worth sending across the dark between stars in a ship full of human beings who will live and love and grieve and wonder in the in-between. It is, in the end, the only answer to the why that matters. We do it because we are the kind of thing that does it. Because curiosity, applied with sufficient seriousness and sufficient courage and sufficient commitment to the people carrying it, is the most powerful force our species has ever produced, more powerful than any engine, more durable than any hull, more essential to the success of any mission than any technology we could design or any institution we could build. We do it because the stars are there, and because we are here, and because the distance between those two facts is exactly the size of everything we are capable of becoming. The universe is strange and beautiful and incomprehensibly large, and we are, improbably, here in it, asking questions, reaching further, carrying the story forward. That is enough. That is everything. And there is so much more to explore. Check the next video on the screen if this video left you wanting to go further. If you're ready to actually take that journey to Proxima Centauri, step by step, phase by phase, with real astrophysics and real numbers, click it. You won't regret it.